The age of heroes had passed, but their blood still moved quietly through the hills. Lavinium slept in peace beside the sea, its stones warmed by decades of sunlight, while far inland, Alba Longa stood proud and white against the morning. Generations had risen and fallen since the death of Aeneas. The people no longer spoke of Troy as a wound, but as a legend. The fields that once drank the sweat of refugees now fed the children of kings. It was an age of prosperity, though not of innocence. Peace, when it lasts too long, grows delicate, like glass that forgets it can shatter. The hills whispered of change long before the people noticed. Alba Longa had grown rich. Traders came from distant valleys, the temples gleamed with polished marble, and the priests who once thanked the gods for survival now prayed mostly for stability. The name of Aeneas was still spoken at festivals, but only as tradition, a ritual syllable at the start of a speech no one truly heard. Yet fate, that quiet weaver, was not done with his descendants. In the house of King Procas, last of the elder line, 2 sons were born, Numitor, the firstborn, steady and thoughtful, and Romulus, the second, clever and restless. They were the twin faces of ambition, one calm as stone, the other sharp as a blade. The people adored Numitor. He listened more than he spoke, judged fairly, and found joy in simple order. Romulus, meanwhile, smiled too easily and remembered every slight. He had the charm of a man who could sell you your own sandals, and you'd thank him for the deal. The priest said that when the brothers were children, Romulus once swapped a sacred olive wreath for a bag of almonds. He said it was a test of faith. No one believed him, but the almonds were good. When King Procas grew old, the question of succession hung heavy in the palace. He named Numitor as heir, trusting that kindness was strength enough to rule. But kindness rarely prepares you for treachery. Romulus watched, smiling, waiting. In his eyes, kingship was not a duty, but a stage that had been unfairly promised to someone else. And so the peace of Alba Longa, that long inheritance of Aeneas's line, began to tremble. This is where our story turns again, away from the sunlight of Lavinium and into the long shadow of ambition. It is a story of blood and exile, of gods who whisper in dreams, and of 2 brothers whose choices will shape the cradle of Rome itself. Tonight we begin with betrayal and prophecy, with the flicker of a stolen crown, and the first echo of destiny that will one day awaken beside the Tiber. This is episode 6, The Shadow over Alba Longa, where the peace of the kings ends, and the legend of the twins begins. The Palatine Hill in spring was a kind of paradise, if you didn't mind mud, sheep, and the smell of both. Wildflowers pushed through grass still wet from morning dew, and the air carried the scent of thyme crushed underfoot. From the hilltop you could see the Tiber winding silver through green valleys, and beyond it, Alba Longa's white walls catching the sun like a promise someone else had made. Gentle 2 young men stood at the summit, staffs in hand, watching their flock drift lazily across the slope. They were brothers, twins actually, though you'd only know it if you looked carefully. Same dark hair, same strong build, same way of standing with weight shifted to one hip like soldiers at rest. But where one moved with deliberate patience, the other carried restlessness in every gesture. Thoughtful, gentle, Romulus, the elder by minutes that had somehow stretched into temperament, scanned the horizon with the focus of someone always calculating distance, risk, and advantage. His eyes were sharp, his jaw set, and when he spoke it was usually to issue instructions or ask questions that sounded like tests. At 22 he looked 30, not from age, but from the weight of seriousness he carried like armor. Friendly, warm, Remus, the younger, sat on a sun-warmed rock and whittled a piece of wood into something that might become a flute, or might just become kindling. He whistled while he worked, off-key but enthusiastic, and occasionally threw pebbles at sheep that wandered too close to the edge. Where Romulus planned, Remus improvised. Where Romulus frowned, Remus grinned. They were halves of something whole, and anyone watching could tell that neither quite worked without the other. They'd been shepherds their entire lives, or at least their entire remembered lives. Faustulus and Acca Larentia had raised them on this hill, in a stone hut that leaked when it rained and baked like an oven in summer. The old couple had taught them everything: how to tend sheep, how to read weather in the colour of the sky, how to defend a flock from wolves with nothing but a staff and confidence. The twins had been good students, maybe too good. By 15, they were better with the staff than Faustulus. By 18, other shepherds asked them to settle disputes. By 20, they led a loose confederation of hill shepherds who looked to them for protection, guidance, and the occasional well-timed joke that diffused tension before it became violence. They didn't know why people followed them. It just seemed natural, the way water flows downhill. Romulus assumed it was because he made good decisions. Remus assumed it was because he made people laugh. Both were half right. "That ewe is limping again," Romulus said, nodding toward a sheep, picking its way carefully across the hillside. Remus glanced up from his whittling. The grey one? The grey one. She's always limping. I think she's faking it for sympathy. Romulus almost smiled. Sheep don't fake injuries. This one does. Watch her when she thinks no one's looking. She's fine. Romulus did watch. The ewe limped dramatically toward a patch of clover, then immediately forgot her disability and started eating. Huh, Romulus said. See? Remus grinned. Even sheep have personalities. You just have to pay attention. It was the kind of small observation that made Remus valuable in ways people didn't always recognize. He noticed things, tiny details that seemed irrelevant until suddenly they weren't. A shepherd who'd been too quiet lately, a change in the wind that meant rain was coming from an unexpected direction, which merchants in the valley would trade fairly, and which would try to cheat you if your Latin wasn't perfect. Romulus noticed bigger things. Patrol routes, potential threats, how to position the flock to maximize grazing while minimizing theft risk. Between them, they saw everything worth seeing. Their foster father Faustulus watched them from the doorway of the hut, his weathered face unreadable. He was old now, truly old, the kind where standing up required a moment of negotiation with one's knees, but his eyes were still clear, and they tracked his sons with a mixture of pride and something else. Worry, maybe. Or the look of someone keeping a secret that gets heavier every year. Acalarentia appeared beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. She was rounder than she'd been when they were children, her hair completely grey now, but her hands were still quick, and her voice still carried when she wanted it to. They're good boys, she said quietly. Faustulus nodded. They are. But they're not boys anymore. No. Dental Romulus point out something in the distance. Probably another shepherd's flock encroaching on their traditional grazing area, and Remus stand, already preparing to walk down and negotiate, probably with charm and just enough implied threat to make the point. When are you going to tell them? Acalarentia asked. Faustulus sighed. When they need to know. And when is that? I'll know it when it happens. They'd had this conversation before. Many times. The answer never changed, but the question kept being asked because the truth kept pressing closer. The twins weren't normal. They never had been. And pretending otherwise was becoming harder each year. Life on the Palatine Hill followed rhythms older than Rome. Older than Alba Longa. Maybe older than the gods themselves. Dawn meant leading the flock to graze. Noon meant finding shade and water. Dusk meant bringing everyone home and counting to make sure wolves hadn't taken tribute. Night meant fire, food, and the kind of tired that feels earned. Friendly. Warm. The twins had neighbours. Other shepherds scattered across the 7 hills that ringed the Tiber's bend. Some were friendly. Some were rivals. Most were both, depending on the day and whether anyone's sheep had wandered into someone else's grazing area. Today, for instance, featured a visit from Sella, a shepherd from the Quirinal Hill, whose definition of neighbouring pasture was flexible enough to include anywhere he felt like going. He was loud, opinionated, and loyal in the way that made him either your best ally or your most annoying problem, depending on which side of an argument he'd chosen. Romulus, Celior shouted, climbing the hill with the energy of someone who'd either had too much wine or not enough sleep. We have a situation. Romulus closed his eyes briefly, counting to 3 in the universal language of people who deal with Celior regularly. What kind of situation? The Aventine shepherds are saying we can't use the river crossing anymore. Remus looked up, interested now. Which crossing? The good one. The shallow one. They're saying it's theirs. It's not theirs, Romulus said flatly. I know it's not theirs. Celior agreed enthusiastically. That's why I came to you. We should go down there and gentle talk to them. Remus finished. Celior deflated slightly. I was going to say something more direct. Talking is direct, Remus said. It's just direct with fewer broken bones. Where's the fun in that? But Celior was smiling. He liked to bluster, but he wasn't stupid. The twins had a way of settling things that left everyone feeling heard, even if nobody got exactly what they wanted. Romulus stood, brushing grass from his tunic. We'll go at sunset. Let them have their day, then we'll show up for a conversation. Why sunset? Celior asked. Because, Remus explained, people are tired at sunset. Tired people negotiate better than angry people. Give them all day to get hot and bothered, then show up when they're too exhausted to fight properly. Thoughtful, Celior considered this. You two think about this stuff too much. That's why you come to us, Romulus pointed out. Sunset found them at the disputed river crossing, where the Tiber ran shallow enough to wade across without soaking anything above your knees. 3 Aventine shepherds waited there, arms crossed, trying to look intimidating. They managed threatening enough, but the effect was somewhat undermined by one of them being obviously the younger brother of someone else, and clearly wishing he was somewhere else. "Evening," Remus called out, friendly as if they were meeting for wine instead of a territorial dispute. "Heard you wanted to talk about the crossing." The lead Aventine shepherd, a man named Palatinus, thick-built and skeptical, nodded once. "Not talk, tell. This crossing is ours. We're tired of you hill people acting like the Tiber belongs to everyone." Romulus stepped forward, not aggressive but not deferring either. "The river belongs to everyone because the river belongs to no one. Our flocks have used this crossing for 2 generations. Well, now it's ours," Palatinus said. "Says who? Says me. And if we disagree?" There was a moment where violence could have happened. You could see it gathering in the air like a storm deciding whether to rain. Palatinus's hand drifted toward the knife at his belt. Selefra shifted his weight, ready. The younger brother looked even more uncomfortable. Then Remus laughed. Not mockingly, genuinely, like he'd just heard a good joke. "You know what? This is stupid. We're all standing here pretending we're willing to stab each other over a stretch of river that's going to be here long after we're dead. Let's be smarter than that." Gentle Palatinus blinked, thrown off by the shift in tone. "What are you suggesting?" "Take turns," Remus said simply. "Your flocks cross morning and evening. Ours cross midday and night. Everybody gets access. Nobody has to bleed. Nobody has to explain to their mother why they got stabbed arguing about water." The younger brother looked relieved. Palatinus looked like he was doing math in his head, checking for traps. Romulus watched carefully, reading the room, ready to back Remus's play or adjust if needed. But Remus had judged it right. Palatinus wanted a solution, not a fight. He just needed it offered in a way that let him save face. "Fine," Palatinus said eventually, "but if your flocks damage the bank—" "We'll fix it," Romulus cut in. "Same as we'd expect from you." Palatinus studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "Deal. Friendly. Warm." They shook on it, actual hand-clasping, binding as any contract signed in ink. The Aventine shepherds left. Celery let out a breath he'd been holding. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" Remus asked innocently. "Make people not fight when they came specifically to fight." Romulus smiled slightly. "We give them something better than fighting. Which is feeling smart instead of feeling tough." That night, back at the hut, Faustulus listened to the story of the river crossing and said nothing, but his eyes followed Romulus with an intensity that made the young man uncomfortable. "What?" Romulus finally asked. "Nothing," Faustulus said. You remind me of someone." "Who?" "Someone who ruled," Faustulus said quietly. Then he stood and went inside before anyone could ask more questions. Gentle, Remus and Romulus exchanged glances. Their foster father had been doing that lately, making cryptic comments, looking at them like he was seeing someone else. It was unsettling in ways neither could quite articulate. Later, as the fire burned low and most people slept, Remus lay on his back looking at stars. "Do you ever feel like we're supposed to do something?" he asked the darkness. "Like what?" Romulus's voice came from nearby, still awake. "I don't know. Something bigger than sheep. Everything is bigger than sheep. You know what I mean." Romulus did know. He felt it too. A restlessness that had nothing to do with boredom and everything to do with the sense that they were waiting for something without knowing what they were waiting for. Like actors standing in the wings, hearing their cue but not yet stepping onto the stage. "Maybe," Romulus said finally. "But for now, we have sheep." "For now, we have sheep," Remus agreed, and they both pretended that was enough. Above them, stars wheeled in patterns neither understood. Somewhere those stars held meaning, auguries and prophecies and the promises of gods who'd taken interest in 2 boys nursed by a wolf and marked for something neither could yet imagine. But tonight they were just shepherds, lying on a hill, watching the sky, not knowing that everything they thought they understood was about to change forever. Trouble came the way it usually does. Not announced, not dramatic, just a slow accumulation of small irritations that suddenly tips into something larger. For 3 weeks, Alba Longa's royal shepherds had been pushing boundaries, grazing their flocks in areas that traditionally belonged to the hill people. Not overtly aggressive, just present, testing, seeing what they could get away with. The hill shepherds grumbled but mostly let it slide. Alba Longa was powerful. King Amulius was not a man you challenged lightly. His shepherds wore his colours, carried his authority, and had the swagger of people who knew they had soldiers behind them if things went wrong. Better to share grazing land than start a war you couldn't win. But there's sharing, and then there's being pushed off your own hill. When Amulius's chief shepherd, a man named Numitor's Bane, because he'd helped overthrow the old king and wore the name like a trophy, drove his flock directly through the Palatine's best spring pasture, trampling new grass and fouling the water, the hill people decided enough was enough. They sent word to Romulus and Remus. Come handle this. You're good at handling things. So the twins came, along with a dozen other shepherds who'd decided that numbers mattered when dealing with royal authority. They found the royal shepherds exactly where expected, sprawled in the shade of the very olive trees the hill people had planted, eating food from packs clearly raided from someone else's stores, acting like they owned not just the grazing land but the entire world. Numitor's Bane stood when he saw them approach. He was older than the twins, maybe 35, with the thick build of someone who'd spent years swinging a staff and the confidence of someone who'd spent those years winning. Behind him, a half-dozen royal shepherds rose slowly, taking their time, making it clear they weren't worried. "Afternoon," Remus called out, pleasant as always, giving no indication this was anything but a social visit. "Nice spot you found here. We planted these trees, about 6 years ago. They've grown well." Numitor's Bane smiled without warmth. "They're on the king's land now." "The king's land," Romulus said carefully, "is Alba Longa. This is Palatine Hill. Different place. Everything the king can see is the king's land," Numitor's Bane replied. "That's not how land works," Romulus pointed out cheerfully. "Otherwise my land would be everything I can see, which includes Alba Longa from up here, and I don't think your king would like that math." A few of the hill shepherds chuckled. One of the royal shepherds, younger, nervous, didn't quite hide his grin. Numitor's Bane's jaw tightened. "You think you're clever? We think we're right," Romulus said. "There's a difference." Numitor's Bane took a step forward. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your sheep and find somewhere else to graze. These hills? They're ours now. The king wants more land, so the king takes more land. That's how power works." "And if we refuse?" Remus asked, still smiling, but the smile had gone cold. "Then we take your sheep anyway. And maybe we take more than sheep." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Behind Numitor's Bane, his men shifted, hands moving toward weapons. Behind the twins, the hill shepherds did the same. Violence gathered itself, patient and inevitable. Romulus's hand tightened on his staff. He could feel Remus beside him, tense as drawn wire, ready to move. They'd been in fights before, plenty of them, but always against equals. Other shepherds, bandits, wolves, never against royal authority. Never against the kind of power that could send soldiers if you pushed back too hard. And yet, looking at Numitor's Bane's face, at the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no, Romulus felt something unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not fear, not even anger exactly. Just a cold, clear certainty that this was wrong, and wrong things needed to be corrected, regardless of who wore which colours. "Gentle," Noel, Romulus said quietly. "What?" "No," Romulus repeated, louder now. "We're not leaving. This is our land. Our families have grazed here for generations. You don't get to just take it because your king is greedy." Numitor's Bane's face darkened. "You're refusing a direct order from the king's representative." "We're refusing a theft," Remus said, stepping up beside his brother. "There's a difference." The royal shepherds moved first. Not all of them. The nervous young one hung back. But enough. Staffs swung, bodies collided, the air filled with grunts, curses, the crack of wood on wood. It wasn't organized combat, just the chaotic violence of angry men in close quarters. Romulus fought the way he did everything, methodically, efficiently, without wasted motion. Block, strike, move, each action serving a purpose. He dropped one royal shepherd with a blow to the knee, sidestepped another's wild swing, used his staff to trip a third. Remus fought differently. Improvised, creative, occasionally absurd. He dodged a strike by rolling under it, came up throwing a handful of dirt in someone's face, then used his staff like a lever to vault over another attacker entirely. He was grinning the whole time, which somehow made him more unsettling than his brother's cold focus. The hill shepherds held their own. They were outnumbered but fighting for their home, which counts for something. Sella fought like a man possessed, roaring challenges that might have been inspiring, or might have just been noise. The tide shifted back and forth, first the royal shepherds gaining ground, then the hill people pushing them back. Then Remus made a mistake. Small thing. A step on loose stone, an ankle turning wrong. He stumbled, just for a second, just long enough. Numitor's Bane saw it, lunged. His staff caught Remus across the temple. Not full force he'd slipped to, but hard enough. Remus went down, dazed, blood running from a cut above his eye. Romulus saw it happen, saw his brother fall, and something inside him broke loose. What happened next? People would argue about later. Some said Romulus moved like Mars himself. Divine fury, unstoppable force. Others said it was simpler than that. Just a frightened man protecting his brother with the strength fear provides. Either way, Romulus reached Remus before Numitor's Bane could strike again. The fight ended quickly after that. Romulus stood over Remus, staff ready, eyes promising violence to anyone who came closer. The royal shepherds, sensing the shift, backed away. Even Numitor's Bane, reading the moment, held up a hand. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Romulus agreed. "It's not. The king will hear about this." "Good," Romulus said. "Tell him to come himself next time if he wants our land. We'll give him the same answer." Numitor's Bane's eyes narrowed. Then he smiled. Sharp, cold, promising future pain. "Actually, I have a better idea." He gestured to his men. They moved suddenly, coordinated, clearly planned, not attacking Romulus. They'd learnt that lesson, but surrounding Remus, who was still on the ground, vision swimming, unable to defend himself properly. "What are you doing?" Romulus demanded, stepping forward, staffs levelled at him, stopping his advance. "Taking a thief," Numitor's Bane said. "What? Your brother assaulted the king's representative. That's a crime. He'll answer for it in Alba Longa." Gentle, desperate. "He defended our land." "He struck me," Numitor's Bane said, touching the small bruise on his jaw where Remus had landed one lucky hit early in the fight. "The law is clear. He comes with us." Romulus looked at the staffs pointed at him, at the royal shepherds dragging Remus to his feet, at his brother's dazed, bleeding face. He calculated, fight, and probably die. Probably get Remus killed too, or let them take him, and what? Figure something out, find another way. Remus met his eyes, managed a smile despite the blood. "It's fine," he said, words slightly slurred. "I've always wanted to see the palace." "Remus, go," Remus said. "Tell mother I'm having dinner with royalty. She'll be impressed." The royal shepherds bound Remus's hands, not roughly but firmly. He didn't resist. Romulus watched, staff in hand, surrounded by his own people who looked to him for orders and found only helpless rage. "If anything happens to him," Romulus said quietly. Numitor's Bane smiled. "Then what? You'll complain? To whom? We're the law here, shepherd, remember that." They took Remus away, down the hill toward Alba Longa. Romulus watched until they disappeared from sight. Then he turned to Sella to the others, and saw in their faces the same thing he felt, powerlessness dressed as patience, waiting for its chance to become something else. Faustulus found him at sunset, standing at the hill's edge, staring toward Alba Longa's distant walls. The old man said nothing at first, just stood beside his foster son and watched the dying light, gentle, soft. "They took Remus," Romulus said finally. "I know, I should have fought. You'd be dead, maybe." Faustulus sighed. "Maybe it's time I told you something." Romulus turned, studied his foster father's face, saw something there he'd never seen before. Not quite fear, not quite hope. Something heavier. "Told me what?" "The truth," Faustulus said. "About who you are, about why they took your brother, about why this matters more than you know." Romulus waited. Faustulus took a breath, choosing words carefully. "You weren't born in that hut. You weren't born to me in Acca Larentia, though we loved you as ours." He paused. 22 years ago, I was ordered to drown 2 infants in the Tiber, babies of a woman named Rhea Silvia, who claimed Mars had fathered them. King Amulius wanted them dead, so his throne would stay secure. Romulus's breath caught. "I couldn't do it," Faustulus continued. "I put you in the river, yes, but I put you gently, and when you survived, when a she-wolf nursed you, when the gods clearly wanted you alive, I knew. I took you home, raised you, kept the secret." "Rhea Silvia," Romulus repeated. "Who is she?" "Was. She's dead now, buried alive as punishment. But she was King Numitor's daughter, the true king, before Amulius stole his throne." The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. "Numitor is our grandfather." "Yes, and Amulius is the man who tried to have you killed, who killed your mother, who stole what should have been your family's crown. Thoughtful, gentle Romulus looked back toward Alba Longa, toward where his brother was being held, toward the city ruled by the man who'd ordered them drowned as infants, and he felt something shift inside him. Not just anger, but purpose, direction. The restlessness he'd carried his whole life suddenly had a name. Remus doesn't know, not yet. He needs to. He will, Faustulus said. If Numitor sees him, and he will, because the king will want the old man to witness his grandson's punishment, he'll recognize something. He'll figure it out. He spent 20 years looking for you without knowing what he was looking for. Drogards him to face his foster father fully. Why tell me now? Because, Faustulus said, your brother is in that city, and you're going to go get him. And when you do, you should know what you're walking into. You're not just shepherds anymore. You never were. You're princes. You're the rightful heirs to Alba Longa. And whether you want it or not, that matters. The sun disappeared below the horizon. Darkness spread across the hills like a blanket being pulled over sleeping land. In Alba Longa, torches were being lit. In one of those buildings, Remus sat waiting, not knowing that his brother now knew their true story, not knowing that everything was about to change. Romulus looked down at his hands. Shepherd's hands, calloused from staffs and rope and years of simple work. Soon they might hold something else. Weapons, power, destiny. Tomorrow, Romulus said. Tomorrow I go to Alba Longa. Not alone, Faustulus said. No, Romulus agreed. Not alone. Behind them, the hut's windows glowed warm. Arca was cooking dinner that two sons wouldn't be home to eat. The sheep were bedded down for the night. The Palatine Hill settled into darkness, unaware that its shepherds were about to become something far more dangerous. Princes who'd been raised to fight for what was theirs, and who'd just learnt they'd been robbed of everything. Alba Longa at dawn looked like something out of a story. White walls catching first light, smoke rising from breakfast fires, the ordered chaos of a city waking to its daily work. From inside, though, if you were a prisoner with your hands bound and a guard who wouldn't meet your eyes, it looked less mythic and more like any other place where power decided who suffered and who didn't. Gentle, Remus had been thrown in a storage room beneath the palace. Not a proper cell, just a space where they kept grain sacks and forgotten furniture. The door was locked, the window too small to climb through, and his head still throbbed from where the staff had caught him. But he was alive, which felt like more than he'd had a right to expect. He'd spent the night trying to pick the rope binding his wrists using a nail he'd found in the wall. It hadn't worked. Whoever tied the knots knew their craft. But it had given him something to do besides think about how spectacularly the day had gone wrong. By morning, his wrists were raw, and the rope was still secure. Progress. Footsteps approached. Multiple sets. Remus straightened, trying to look less like someone who'd been sleeping on grain sacks and more like someone whose capture was a temporary inconvenience. The door opened. Guards entered first, then Numitor's Bane, looking smug. And behind him someone unexpected. An old man. Very old, with white hair and a beard that reached his chest, wearing robes that had once been fine but were now just clean and carefully mended. He moved slowly, aided by a walking stick, but his eyes were sharp. They swept the room, found Remus, and stopped. Something flickered across the old man's face. Surprise, recognition, something deeper. "This is the one?" the old man asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried authority that made even Numitor's Bane straighten slightly. "Yes, Lord Numitor," the shepherd said. "Assaulted me and my men over grazing rights. Typical hill rabble. Thought you should see him before the king decides his punishment." Numitor. The name meant nothing to Remus, but the way the old man was staring at him felt significant, like he was being examined not for crimes but for answers to questions nobody had asked aloud. "What's your name, boy?" Numitor asked. "Remus," he said. "Just Remus. My family doesn't go in for complicated naming traditions. We're simple shepherds." Numitor took a step closer, studying Remus's face with an intensity that was becoming uncomfortable. "How old are you?" 22. "Why? And your parents?" "Faustulus and Acca. They raised me and my brother on the Palatine Hill. Is this relevant to whether you're going to execute me?" Gentle Saft trembled on his walking stick. "Your brother, a twin?" Remus blinked. "How did you? You have the look of someone I knew once, someone who died a long time ago." The old man's voice had gone soft, distant. "What happened to your mother, your birth mother?" "I was told she died," Remus said carefully. "We were found as infants. Foster parents took us in, found where. The old man's intensity was growing, becoming something that looked dangerously close to hope. By the river, the Tiber. Remus didn't know why he was answering. Something in the old man's face demanded honesty. In a basket nursed by a wolf, if you believe the story. Personally, I think Faustulus embellished that part. Numitor sat down heavily on a grain sack, as if his legs had suddenly forgotten their purpose. The guards exchanged glances. Numitor's bane frowned. "My lord, are you well?" "Get out," Numitor said quietly. "What?" "Get out. All of you. I need to speak with this young man alone." Numitor's bane's jaw tightened. The king said. "The king answers to me in matters of my household," Numitor said, voice hardening. "Or have we forgotten that I still hold some authority in this city, despite my nephew's ambitions?" The shepherds hesitated, then bowed and left. The door closed. Remus and the old man were alone. Numitor studied him for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice shook. 22 years ago, my daughter gave birth to twin boys, sons of Mars, she claimed, though my brother called it a lie to hide a scandal. Amulius ordered them drowned. He forced me to watch as they were taken away. He paused, collecting himself. I never saw them again. I thought them dead. Gentle Furquil's wrath caught. "Your daughter, Rhea Silvia, my only child. Amulius buried her alive for breaking her vows as a Vestal virgin." The old man's eyes were wet now. She was 19. She'd done nothing wrong except exist as a threat to his throne. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The story Faustulus had hinted at but never told fully. The way Remus and Romulus had always felt different, like they were waiting for something. The she-wolf that supposedly nursed them, not metaphor but truth. "You're saying," Remus started. "I'm saying you and your brother are my grandsons," Numitor said. "Sons of Mars and Rhea Silvia. Rightful heirs to Alba Longa. The children Romulus tried to murder and failed." Remus laughed. He couldn't help it. The sound came out strangled, halfway between humour and hysteria. "I'm a shepherd. You're a prince. I smell like sheep. You smell like hope," Numitor said fiercely. "You smell like justice delayed but not denied. You smell like the answer to 20 years of grief." Gentle, Remus shook his head, trying to process. "If this is true, if any of this is remotely true, why didn't anyone tell us? Why did Faustulus keep it secret?" "Because Amulius still rules," Numitor said. "Because the man who tried to kill you once would gladly finish the job. Because sometimes the only way to keep princes alive is to let them think they're peasants." Thoughtful Judamusino. "I don't know what your brother knows, but if he's half as clever as you seem to be, he's probably figuring it out right now." Numitor leaned forward. "Tell me about him. Tell me about both of you." So Remus did. He talked about growing up on the Palatine Hill, about learning to tend sheep and settle disputes and fight when necessary. He talked about Romulus's serious intensity and his own tendency to joke when things got tense. He talked about feeling like they were meant for something bigger without knowing what bigger meant. Friendly, warm Numitor listened to all of it, and with each word his face transformed. Grief remained, but something else grew alongside it. Pride, wonder, the cautious joy of someone who'd stopped hoping and suddenly found reason to start again. "You're exactly like her," he said when Remus finished. "Your mother. She had that same way of making terrible situations feel manageable. Gentle. I don't remember her," Remus said quietly. "No, but she would have remembered you. In those last moments, knowing you were being taken, she would have held on to the thought of you. It would have been what sustained her." Numitor's voice broke slightly. "I've spent 20 years wondering if those babies felt fear, if they cried, if the river was cold." "The river was fine," Remus said, though he had no memory of it. "The wolf was warm, and Faustulus and Acalarentia gave us a good life. They loved us. That matters." "It does," Numitor agreed. "But it doesn't change what you are, or what you need to do." "Which is?" "Take back what's yours," Numitor said. "Amulius sits on a throne he stole. He murdered your mother, tried to murder you, and has ruled for 20 years through fear and manipulation. The people don't love him. They tolerate him because they don't have a choice. But if they had a choice, if they had someone with a legitimate claim who could rally support, you're suggesting rebellion. I'm suggesting justice. That's just rebellion with better marketing." Numitor smiled despite himself. "Yes, I suppose it is." They talked for hours. Numitor explained the politics of Alba Longa, who supported Amulius out of fear, who might be persuaded to switch sides. which guards were loyal to the crown versus loyal to whoever paid best. He drew diagrams in the dust on the floor, showing the palace layout, the armory, the routes in and out. "You're very prepared for someone who's been in exile," Remus observed. "I've had 20 years to plan," Numitor said. "I just never had anyone to execute the plan with, until now." "Bold of you to assume I'm going to help." "You're going to help," Numitor said confidently. "Because your brother is coming. Probably tomorrow. Probably with every shepherd he can gather. And when he arrives, you'll want to be free and armed and ready to help him not die stupidly." Remus grinned. "You barely know us, and you already have our whole dynamic figured out." "I know you're my blood," Numitor said. "That's enough." The door opened. A different guard this time. Younger, nervous. "Lord Numitor, the king summons you, and the prisoner." Numitor stood slowly. "We're coming." He looked at Remus. "Don't do anything clever yet. Let Romulus think you're just a troublesome shepherd. The longer he underestimates you, the better our chances." "Friendly. Soft, not that," Numitor said. "But try anyway." The throne room was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd stolen power overwrought, trying too hard, decorated with the kind of excess that screamed insecurity. Gold everywhere, silk banners, a throne that was 3 sizes too large for anyone who sat in it. Romulus sat in that throne, looking bored. He was in his 50s, handsome in a weathered way, with the build of someone who'd been a warrior once but had spent the last 2 decades eating well and exercising less. His crown, Alba Longa's crown, Numitor's crown, sat slightly crooked on his head. He looked up when they entered. "Uncle. And our guest, the shepherd who thinks he can assault my representatives without consequence." His voice was smooth, practiced, the tone of someone who'd spent years making threats sound like observations. Numitor said, overeager perhaps, but not malicious. "A fine would suffice." "A fine," Romulus smiled, "for striking a man wearing my colours? No, I think an example needs to be made. The hill people need to understand there are consequences for defying Alba Longa." Remus kept his mouth shut. "Humble," he reminded himself. "Don't be clever. Let the king think you're nobody." But oh, how he wanted to say something about stolen thrones and murdered mothers and divine parentage. The words sat on his tongue like coals burning to be spoken. Romulus studied him. "You don't look frightened." "Should I be?" Remus asked. "Most people are when facing execution." "Most people haven't been nursed by wolves," Remus said, and immediately regretted it. So much for humble. Something flickered in Romulus's eyes. Interest. Suspicion. He leaned forward. "Wolves. How metaphorical are we being?" "Very metaphorical," Numitor cut in quickly. "Hill people tell tall tales. It's cultural. I'm sure it is." Romulus didn't look convinced. He gestured to a guard. "Take him back to his cell. I'll decide his fate tomorrow." He looked at Numitor. "You may go, uncle. Thank you for your input. As always, I treasure your counsel." The words were polite. The dismissal was absolute. Numitor bowed, not deep, just enough to be technically respectful, and turned to leave. As Remus was led past him, the old man caught his eye and mouthed 2 words. "Tomorrow. Ready." Remus nodded, once, barely. Then he was being escorted back through corridors that suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a battlefield he was learning to navigate. That night, alone again in his storage room cell, Remus lay on the grain sacks and thought about mothers he'd never known and grandfathers he'd just met, and brothers who were probably planning something reckless. He thought about wolves and rivers, and how prophecy had a way of hiding in plain sight until suddenly it wasn't hidden at all. Somewhere above him, in the palace proper, Romulus was probably sleeping soundly, secure in his stolen power. Somewhere outside the city walls, Romulus was probably planning an assault, and somewhere in between, Numitor was probably moving pieces on a board Romulus didn't know existed. Thoughtful, Remus smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. Friendly, warm mother, he whispered to the ceiling, to the night, to whatever divine attention might still be watching. If you're listening, we could use some of that protection you gave us as babies. Things are about to get complicated. The night offered no answer. But then again, the gods rarely did. They just watched and waited, and occasionally tilted the board when mortals weren't paying attention. Remus closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow, he'd be a prince. Tonight, he was still a shepherd who'd gotten himself captured. Both truths existed at once. That, he was learning, was how destinies worked. News travelled slowly in those days, but anger moved faster. By the time the sun rose over the Palatine Hill, every shepherd within a day's walk knew that Remus had been taken. By midday, Romulus knew why. Gentle Faustulus told him everything. Not in the house. Acalarentia couldn't bear to hear it again. But outside, sitting on the stone wall where the twins had sat as boys, watching their flocks and dreaming of nothing more complicated than which girl from the village might smile at them during the harvest festival. The old shepherd's voice shook as he spoke, but he didn't stop. The basket, the river, the wolf, the certainty that the babies were meant to die, and the miracle that they hadn't. Thoughtful, Romulus listened without interrupting. That was his way. Hear everything, process everything, then act. Romulus would have been on his feet halfway through the story, demanding answers, making plans, probably doing something reckless. But Romulus sat still, hands folded, watching the horizon, as if he could see all the way to Alba Longa and the brother who was waiting there. When Faustulus finished, Romulus asked only one question. "Our mother, Rhea Silvia, is she alive?" "No, son. She died 22 years ago, buried alive by Amulius's order." Romulus nodded once. The information settled into him the way stone settles into earth, heavy, permanent, foundational. And Numitor still lives, powerless but alive. He'll be your ally if you're wise enough to find him. And Amulius sits on a throne he stole, in a city that should be ours, holding my brother prisoner. Romulus stood. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it now, something that hadn't been there before. Not rage. Rage was too hot, too quick to burn out. This was colder, more patient. How many men can we gather by nightfall? Gentle Faustulus looked at the young man he'd raised. This boy who'd just learned he was a prince, a grandson of kings, a son of Mars himself, and saw no hesitation. No doubt, just the terrible clarity of someone who'd been given a purpose and intended to fulfill it. 50 maybe, 60 if we call in favours from the villagers. Call them in, Romulus said. All of them. By sunset, 73 men stood on the Palatine Hill. Shepherds, mostly, a few farmers, one blacksmith who owed Faustulus money and figured this was as good a way as any to settle the debt. They weren't soldiers, most had never held a weapon more dangerous than a staff, but they were loyal and they were angry, and Romulus had a way of making you believe that loyalty and anger might be enough. Friendly, warm. He stood on the same wall where Faustulus had told him the truth, addressing the gathered men with the kind of calm authority that made you forget he was only 22. "Amulius of Alba Longa has my brother," he said. "He thinks Remus is just a shepherd who caused trouble. He doesn't know Remus is a prince. He doesn't know I'm coming, and he definitely doesn't know that you're all willing to walk into his city and politely explain that he's been sitting on the wrong throne for 20 years. Someone in the crowd laughed. "That's one way to put it." "Here's another way to put it," Romulus continued. "Amulus murdered our mother. He tried to murder us. He stole the throne from our grandfather, Numitor, who by all accounts is a decent man who didn't deserve to spend 2 decades watching a usurper play king. We're going to fix that. Tonight." The men shifted, glancing at each other. 73 shepherds against the garrison of Alba Longa wasn't terrible odds, it was suicidal odds. But there was something about the way Romulus said it, calm and certain, that made it sound less like a death march, and more like an inevitability they were privileged to witness. "We're not going as raiders," Romulus said. "We're going as rightful heirs. Numitor will help us from inside. I'll make contact with him first." We split into 3 groups, one at the north gate, one at the south, one with me through the east entrance near the palace. We move fast, we move quiet, and we don't kill anyone unless they make us. This isn't about vengeance, it's about correction. He paused, looking at each face in turn. "If any man here wants to leave, leave now. No shame. This isn't your fight." Gentle. No one moved. Faustulus, standing at the edge of the group, felt something in his chest tighten. Pride, fear, the strange ache of watching a child you raised become someone you barely recognize but deeply admire. Acalarentia beside him squeezed his hand. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying louder. Romulus nodded. "Then let's go get my brother." They reached Alba Longa 3 hours before dawn. The city slept the way cities do when they think themselves safe. Gates closed but not barred, guards present but not particularly vigilant, the kind of institutional confidence that comes from never having been seriously threatened. Amulius had ruled for 20 years. 20 years was long enough to make people forget that power could be taken as easily as it had been given. Romulus sent his first group, 20 men led by a shepherd named Cato, who had the kind of face that made you trust him immediately to the north gate with instructions to wait for the signal. The second group, slightly smaller, moved to the south entrance. They would create noise, draw attention, make the garrison think the attack was coming from there. Classic misdirection. Remus would have appreciated it. Gentle, Romulus took the remaining 30 men with him. They moved through the olive groves east of the city, where the wall was lowest and the guards were fewest. One sentry stood at the postern gate, half asleep, leaning on his spear like it was a walking stick. He never saw them coming. They bound and gagged him. No blood, no noise, and slipped inside. The palace loomed ahead, white stone catching starlight, looking serene and permanent in the way things do right before they stop being either. Romulus led his men through the narrow streets, avoiding the main thoroughfares, moving like shadows. Faustulus had drawn him a map from memory. He'd been to Alba Longa twice in his youth, and somehow, miraculously, it was accurate. They reached the palace's eastern courtyard. 2 guards stood at the servants' entrance. Romulus raised a hand, signalling his men to wait, and stepped forward alone. He walked with the kind of confidence that made the guards straighten, uncertain whether they were looking at a threat or someone who had every right to be there. "Friendly, I need to speak with Lord Numitor," Romulus said quietly. "It's urgent." The guards exchanged glances. "It's the middle of the night. Lord Numitor is asleep." "Then wake him," Romulus said. "Tell him his grandson is here." Numitor arrived 10 minutes later, wrapped in a sleeping robe, looking old and tired and utterly awake. He studied Romulus with the same intensity he'd directed at Remus hours earlier. The same desperate hope, the same barely controlled emotion. "You're the other one," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Romulus. You have my brother." "I know." Numitor stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch Romulus's face, then stopping himself. "You look like her, both of you, exactly like Rhea Silvia." His voice cracked on her name. Romulus let the old man look, let him grieve, let him see in flesh and blood that his daughter's children had survived, had grown strong, had come home. Then, gently, "We need to move. I have men positioned throughout the city. If you help us, Amulius falls tonight. If you don't, we'll try anyway, and probably die trying." Numitor's expression shifted, grief giving way to something sharper, more focused. "I've been preparing for this for 20 years. Tell me what you need." They talked quickly, voices low. Numitor's plan was elegant. Half the palace guards were loyal to him, not Amulius. They'd been waiting for an opportunity, any opportunity, to restore the rightful king. With Romulus's shepherds outside and Numitor's men inside, the coup wouldn't just be possible, it would be easy. "Remus is in the storage room beneath the throne hall," Numitor said. 2 guards, I can deal with them. You focus on Amulius. He sleeps in the king's chambers, 3rd floor, western wing. 4 guards outside his door." "Only 4? He's arrogant," Numitor said. "Arrogance is a kind of armor until suddenly it isn't." Romulus smiled despite himself. "You're not what I expected." "Friendly, warm, I'm old, not dead," Numitor said. "There's a difference. Now shall we take back my city?" The signal was a torch lit on the palace roof. When it flared, everything happened at once. Cato's men rushed the north gate. The garrison scrambled to respond, rushing toward the sound of shouting and the clash of staffs against shields. The south group created their own chaos, overturning carts, banging on doors, making 70 men sound like 200. And inside the palace, Numitor's loyal guards moved through corridors with practiced efficiency, disarming their colleagues, securing doorways, locking down exits. Gentle, Romulus and 6 of his best men moved up the stairs toward the king's chambers. They encountered no resistance. Numitor's people had already neutralized the guards and reached the ornate doors faster than seemed possible. For a moment Romulus hesitated. On the other side of that door was the man who'd killed his mother, tried to kill him, stolen everything his family should have been. Unthoughtful, he pushed the door open. Amulius was awake, standing by the window in his nightclothes, looking out at the chaos in his city with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and dawning understanding. He turned when the door opened, saw Romulus, saw the men behind him, saw perhaps the future collapsing into the present with all the grace of a falling statue. "You're the other shepherd," Amulius said. His voice was steady. "Give him credit. He wasn't a coward, just a murderer and a thief." "I'm the other grandson." Romulus corrected. Amulius's face went very still. Ah, so the truth is out. He looked at Romulus with something almost like respect. How much do you know? Enough, Romulus said. Rhett Sylvia, the twins, the river, 20 years of lies. 20 years of rule, Amulius corrected. I kept Alba Longa strong. Numitor was weak, too kind, too hesitant. Leadership requires harder virtues. Gentle leadership, Romulus said quietly, doesn't require burying your niece alive or murdering infants. Amulius shrugged. It was an oddly casual gesture for a man facing his death. Do what you came to do, boy. Just make it quick. And when you're king, remember, mercy is expensive. Sometimes you can't afford it. Romulus looked at the man who'd destroyed his family, who'd stolen his grandfather's throne, who'd spent 2 decades sleeping soundly in a bed that wasn't his. He felt no rage, no triumph, just a kind of tired inevitability. I'm not going to kill you, Romulus said. That's not my decision to make. He stepped aside. Numitor stood in the doorway, ancient and terrible, holding a simple dagger. This one, Numitor said softly, is mine. What happened next was quick. The usurper fell. Alba Longa exhaled a breath it had held for 20 years, and somewhere in the storage room beneath the throne hall, Remus, freed by loyal guards, hands finally unbound, stood in a courtyard and looked up at stars he'd last seen as a prisoner, and now saw as a prince. He was grinning when Romulus found him. Friendly. Warm. Took you long enough, Remus said. I was busy, Romulus replied. Overthrowing tyrants, restoring kingdoms, the usual. Denti then embraced. 2 brothers who'd been shepherds at dawn, and princes by midnight, standing in the ruins of someone else's stolen power, trying to figure out what happened next. Above them, the palace guards were swearing new oaths. Around them, the city was waking to a different world. And in the throne room, Numitor sat in the chair that had always been his, looking 20 years younger and infinitely tired. So, Remus said, we're royalty now? Apparently. Does this mean we have to stop smelling like sheep? I certainly hope not, Romulus said. I've grown attached to it. They stood there, brothers in victory, princes by blood, shepherds by choice, and didn't yet know that this moment, this unity, this easy joy would be one of the last they'd share. Destiny was patient. It could wait a little longer. For now there was only dawn breaking over Alba Longa, and 2 young men who'd learnt that sometimes the stories told by firelight aren't stories at all, but prophecies that were simply waiting for the right people to step into them. The wolf had protected them. The river had carried them. Mars had fathered them. And now, finally, the world knew their names. Romulus and Remus, sons of gods, grandsons of kings, brothers in blood and fate. What could possibly go wrong? Alba Longa at dawn had the look of a city exhaling after holding its breath too long. 3 days had passed since Amulius fell. Not enough time to forget the blood, but enough to start pretending it had always been someone else's problem. The market opened, bread was sold, children played in streets that had witnessed coup and counter-coup with the cheerful indifference of children everywhere, who understand instinctively that adults make terrible decisions, and someone has to keep living anyway. Romulus and Remus spent those 3 days learning that royalty was mostly discomfort wrapped in expensive cloth. They had rooms in the palace, actual rooms with actual beds that felt like sleeping on clouds made by someone who'd never actually slept and was guessing what comfort meant. Servants kept trying to dress them in silk that slid against their skin like wearing water, which sounds poetic until you've tried to walk in it. They attended councils where old men discussed grain taxes with the solemnity usually reserved for declaring war or burying kings. Remus thought the whole thing was hilarious. Romulus thought it was exhausting. Both knew, without saying it aloud, that they were wearing borrowed clothes in a borrowed city, playing borrowed roles in a story that wasn't quite theirs. Peace has its own awkwardness, especially when it arrives suddenly after years of something else. The nobles who bowed and called them my lords had eyes that said, "You smell like sheep, and we all know it." The twins didn't mind. They did smell like sheep, and sheep were honest in a way nobility rarely managed. A ram either liked you or headbutted you. There was clarity in that. On the 4th morning, Numitor summoned them to the throne room. Not as grandsons. They'd done plenty of that. Hours of talking and grieving and trying to fill 22 years of emptiness with words that kept falling short. But as princes, officially, with witnesses who stood along the walls looking important and uncomfortable in equal measure. The throne room was smaller than it should have been. Amulius had tried to compensate with gold leaf and silk banners that hung like expensive curtains in a cheap play. Strip all that away and you were left with stone walls, morning light slanting through high windows and a chair. Just a chair, really. An expensive one carved with scenes of Alba Longa's founding, but still fundamentally practically a chair. Numitor sat in it now, looking more comfortable than he had 3 days ago, but still like a man wearing shoes that fit perfectly, yet somehow pinched. He had the expression of someone who'd won something he'd stopped believing he'd ever get back, and now wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Friendly, warm, he gestured to 2 seats placed before the throne. Not thrones themselves, that would have been presumptuous. And Numitor was many things but never presumptuous. Just chairs. Good chairs with cushions embroidered by someone who clearly believed geometric patterns were the height of artistic achievement. The twins sat. Achatate stood behind Romulus. He'd arrived the day before with 50 more men, just in case peace turned out to be temporary, which in his experience it usually was. He watched everything with the careful attention of someone whose job was noticing threats before they became corpses. Numitor studied them for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something rehearsed but genuine. The way a priest recites prayers he's said 1,000 times but still means. "I'm old," he said. "Not dying yet. Let's not be dramatic about it. But old enough to know that rebuilding a city requires more energy than I have left to give." He paused, letting that settle. "I've spent 20 years watching from exile while my brother turned Alba Longa into something I barely recognized. I don't have another 20 years to undo the damage." He leaned forward, and the chair creaked in a way that made everyone pretend they hadn't heard. "I want you to stay. Rule beside me. Learn what I can teach. Which isn't much, but it's something. Then take over when I'm gone and make Alba Longa what it should have been all along." His voice softened. "You're my family, my legacy. The only good thing to come from 22 years of grief and failure." It was generous. More than generous, it was everything a rational person would accept immediately, with gratitude and perhaps a ceremonial bow for good measure. Thoughtful Crouch and Remus glanced at each other. The look lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, an entire conversation happened, the kind twins have when they've spent 22 years learning to read each other's faces like maps. The conversation had no words but perfect clarity, and it ended with both of them arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously. "No," Romulus said quietly, "but thank you." Gentle, soft Numitor's face didn't change. He'd expected this, perhaps. Hoped against it the way people hope against rain when they can already smell it coming. But expected it nonetheless. Why, he asked. Not angry, just curious in the way old people get when they've stopped being surprised by human behavior but still want to understand it. Romulus looked at his hands, shepherd's hands, calloused and scarred, the kind of hands that knew rope and wood and the particular texture of sheep wool when it's been sitting in rain, not the smooth hands of men raised in palaces who'd never lifted anything heavier than a wine cup or a philosophical argument. "Because this isn't ours," he said. "Alba Longa is yours, your city, your throne, your people, your story. We'd just be wearing someone else's clothes and pretending they fit." "We'd be terrible at it anyway," Remus added. "I'd insult half the nobles within a week, probably by accident, possibly on purpose. Romulus would reorganize everything to be more efficient and make everyone miserable because efficiency isn't the same as happiness. We're shepherds. We understand sheep. Sheep make sense. Nobility doesn't." A faint smile crossed Numitor's face despite himself. "You're princes," he said. "Sons of Mars. Grandsons of kings. Divine blood runs through your veins whether you smell like sheep or not." "We're both," Remus said. "Prince and shepherd. Divine and ordinary. Troy and Latium. All mixed together. That's the problem. We don't fit in the categories Alba Longa has ready for us." "We'd break something," Romulus added. "Probably something important. Possibly everything." Gentle, Cripple rose and walked to the window. Slowly, the way old men do when their bodies remember being young and resent the betrayal of time. Outside, Alba Longa moved through its morning business. Market sounds drifting up, children's voices sharp with laughter, the ordinary chaos of a city that had survived its own history and was now just living. Carts creaked, dogs barked, someone was singing, badly but enthusiastically, about wine and women and regrettable decisions. He stood there long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation. The kind where neither person speaks but both understand perfectly what's being said. When he turned back, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Tell me what you want," he said. "Not what makes political sense. Not what's expected of grandsons of kings. Not what I want to hear. Tell me what you actually want, and be honest about it." The brothers looked at each other again, testing something. An idea that had been forming separately in both their minds, growing quietly like plants in different gardens, and only now had space to become solid enough to speak aloud. "We want to build our own city," Romulus said. The room went very quiet. Even the sounds from outside seemed to fade, as if the world itself had paused to listen. The nobles along the walls shifted uncomfortably. One of them coughed. Another adjusted his toga with the nervous energy of someone who desperately wanted to be anywhere else. "On the Palatine Hill," Romulus continued, "where the wolf found us, where we grew up, where we learned to be." He paused, searching for the right word. "Whatever we are now, princes who smell like sheep, shepherds with divine blood, something in between." He looked at Numitor directly. "We want to build something new, something that's ours from the foundation up, not inherited, not restored, but made, built with our own hands from dirt and hope, and probably a lot of mistakes. Friendly. Warm because Alba Longa isn't magnificent," Remus added quickly, because he could see something crumbling in Numitor's expression. "It is. You've built something real here. Something that survived Romulus and his ambitions and 20 years of slow poison. But it's yours. It belongs to you and your people and your history. We need our own." "Why thoughtful? We need to fail on our own terms," Romulus said quietly, "or succeed on them. Either way, ours." Numitor studied them. Really studied them. Not as princes or grandsons or political assets, but as people. His face was unreadable in the way faces become when someone is processing a truth they'd hoped wouldn't arrive but knew was inevitable, like winter or taxes or mortality. Gentle, soft. "You'd leave," he said. Not a question. Not quite acceptance either. Just acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge rain or aging, or the fact that children grow up in a way no matter how tightly you hold them. "We'd visit," Remus said, "constantly. So often you'd get sick of us. We'd show up at harvest expecting wine and bread and sympathy for our terrible city-building decisions. You'd give us all three because you're too kind to tell us to leave. Friendly, warm." "That's not possible," Numitor said. But he smiled when he said it, small and sad and genuine. He returned to his throne and sat heavily, as if his legs had suddenly remembered they were old and entitled to complain about it. "A new city," he said slowly, tasting the words. "On the Palatine Hill." He paused. "That's ambitious." "Stupid is probably more accurate," Romulus admitted. "Possibly suicidal. Definitely impractical." "Cities need people," Numitor said. "Resources. Legitimacy in the eyes of neighboring powers who won't appreciate new competition. They need walls and laws and gods who agree to pay attention. They need..." "Friendly, warm." "We know," Romulus interrupted gently. "We don't have answers for any of those things. We'll figure it out. We're very good at solving problems we don't understand while pretending we know what we're doing." "It's our primary skill," Remus added. "That and sheep. Gentle. Soft. Mostly sheep, honestly," Romulus agreed. Numitor looked at them. These boys, these men, these grandsons who carried his daughter's face in the shape of their eyes and the set of their jaws, and felt pride and grief exist in the same breath, occupying the same space the way fire and smoke do. One couldn't exist without the other. He'd found them and lost them in the same moment, and that felt cruelly appropriate for a man whose life had been defined by things taken away. But he was old enough to know that some things couldn't be kept even if you wanted to. Some people were meant to build rather than inherit. Some destinies were bigger than comfort or safety, or the desperate wish of old men that the world would stop taking things from them. "I'll help you," he said finally, and his voice carried the weight of surrender wrapped in blessing. "Supplies, tools, men if you need them. Alba Longa will recognize your city as an ally, not a threat. I'll send word to the neighboring settlements, prepare them for the idea that two shepherd boys with delusions of grandeur are founding something on the Palatine." He paused. "But you have to promise me something." "What?" Romulus asked. "Gentle build something good," Numitor said. "Something worth what it cost. Your mother died so you could live. The gods saved you for a reason. I don't know what it is, but it has to be more significant than running a mediocre city that collapses in 2 generations." His voice hardened. "Don't waste it building just another settlement that rises and falls and gets forgotten like morning mist. Build something that lasts. Build something that matters. Build something worth Rhea Sylvia's life." Romulus met his grandfather's eyes and saw in them all the weight of 22 years of grief being converted, alchemically, into hope. "We will," he said. "I promise." It was a promise made without knowing what it would require, what it would cost, what it would demand, how much blood would water its foundations. But then, all the best promises are made in ignorance. Knowledge makes cowards of us all. They left Alba Longa at dawn 5 days later. Not sneaking away like thieves, but departing like princes, which meant formal blessings, gifts from nobles who were either genuinely moved or excellently trained in pretending, and a ceremony that took 3 hours and accomplished nothing except making everyone's feet hurt. Faustulus and Acca Larentia had already returned to the Palatine to prepare what they optimistically called the homecoming, which mostly meant making sure the sheep hadn't eaten everything and that the shelters still had roofs. Achates had organised the shepherds who'd helped overthrow Amulius into something resembling an orderly departure formation. It didn't work. Shepherds were congenitally incapable of marching in straight lines, but they tried, and the effort was touching even if the result looked like organised chaos auditioning for a role in a comedy. Numitor walked them to the city gates. He moved slowly now. The energy that had animated him during the coup had faded like a fire burning down to embers, leaving him ancient again. But he insisted on accompanying them. "I won't see you for a while," he said. "I'm old. I'm allowed to be sentimental about goodbyes." "Friendly. Warm, see us before summer," Remus promised. "We'll bring wine, the terrible kind we make from grapes we definitely didn't steal from anyone's vineyard. You'll drink it and lie about it being good because you love us." "I look forward to it," Numitor said, and meant it. At the gate, he embraced each of them in turn. Long enough to be undignified for a king, brief enough to pretend otherwise. When he stepped back, his eyes were bright with tears he refused to let fall, because crying was for private moments, and this was a public goodbye. "Build well, grandsons," he said, voice steady despite everything. "Build something the gods can't ignore and history won't forget." "We'll try not to disappoint you," Romulus said. "You couldn't if you tried," Numitor replied. "You've already given me more than I dreamed possible when I watched your basket float away 22 years ago. Everything else is just blessing piled on top of blessing." He raised his hand in farewell. The twins raised theirs in return. Then they turned and walked through the gate, and Alba Longa disappeared behind them like a dream fading in daylight. Gentle. Soft. They walked, 73 men who'd been shepherds, then revolutionaries, and now what? Citizens of a city that didn't exist yet? Founders? Fools with ambition? All three, probably. Definitely the last one. The road to the Palatine Hill was familiar in the way home is familiar. Not because it's perfect, but because your feet know every stone and your eyes recognize every tree. Comfortable, safe, nothing like the road to Alba Longa had been, which had been weighted with tension and hidden heritage and the possibility of death at every turn. This was just walking, just men going home, except home was about to become something entirely different. Romulus and Remus walked at the front, side by side, the way they always had, the way twins do, occupying space together like two halves of one person. For the first hour neither spoke, just walked, listened to the men behind them turning 3 days of chaos into legend before the week was even finished, embellishing details, adding drama, converting coup into myth with the enthusiastic creativity of people who understood instinctively that truth was less important than a good story. Finally, Remus broke the silence. "So, we're really doing this? Gentle, building a city? Yes. Any idea how one builds a city? Friendly, warm, not even slightly," Romulus admitted. "I assume you start with walls. Everything else probably follows from that. Walls, then houses, then probably arguments about property lines, then taxes, then someone declares themselves emperor and gets assassinated. The usual progression. Walls to keep things out, or walls to keep things in. Both. Neither. Walls to say, here is something sacred. Here is something different from the wilderness around it. Cross this line and you're entering space that matters. Space with rules and gods and people who've agreed to live together without killing each other too often." Gentle, Remus glanced at his brother with an expression caught between surprise and amusement. That's surprisingly poetic for someone who usually communicates in grunts and meaningful silences. "Cheerful, I contain multitudes," Romulus said dryly. "Friendly, warm, you contain sheep," Remus corrected. "Multitudes of sheep, also opinions about sheep, and probably some hay stuck in places hay shouldn't be." "That's what multitudes means," Romulus replied. They reached the Palatine Hill as the sun was setting, that particular golden hour when everything looks like it's been dipped in honey, and the world briefly forgets it's supposed to be harsh. The same hill where they'd played as children, inventing games with sticks and rocks and infinite imagination, where they'd tended flocks and learned the 1,000 small skills of keeping things alive, where they'd watched storms roll in from the west and wondered about futures that seemed impossibly distant and are now somehow arriving. From here you could see for miles, the Tiber winding silver through the valley like a serpent made of light, the 7 hills rising like knuckles from a giant's half-buried fist, empty land that whispered possibility or threat, depending on how optimistic you were feeling. Gentle Faustulus and Acca Laurentia were waiting at the top. The old shepherd looked at his adopted sons, princes now, founders now, still somehow his boys despite everything, and smiled the way parents do when children come home changed. Not better or worse, just different. Carrying experiences he'd never understand but could recognize in the set of their shoulders and the weight behind their eyes. Friendly. Warm. So, Faustulus asked, how was royalty? Overrated, Remus said immediately. Too much bowing. Everyone kept bowing and we had to figure out what to do with our hands while they were doing it. Awkward for everyone involved. The beds were too soft, Romulus added. Like sleeping on clouds made by someone who'd never actually slept and was just guessing. Gentle. And everyone talked about grain taxes, Remus continued, warming to his complaints, like they were discussing the nature of the divine. Passionate arguments about storage methods, heated debates about moisture content. I thought someone was going to declare a holy war over barley. Acca Laurentia looked at them with the sharp perception of someone who'd raised twins and knew exactly when they were hiding something important behind humour. She had the expression mothers get when they know their children are about to announce something that will either make her proud or give her nightmares. Home, she repeated slowly. Or something else. Romulus met her eyes. We're going to build a city, Mother. Here, on these hills. Starting with everyone who wants to be part of it. She didn't look surprised. Maybe she'd always known, the way mothers know things before their children articulate them, sensing futures in the way boys look at horizons or practice sword forms when they think no one's watching. A city, she said. That's ambitious. We've been told, Remus said, several times, with varying degrees of concern and disapproval. And what will you call this city? Faustulus asked. The brothers looked at each other. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't even thought about it, really, beyond the abstract idea of building something new. But the answer came to both of them at once. Obvious and inevitable, the way some truths are, not discovered but recognized. We'll let the gods decide, Romulus said. Through augury. We'll watch the sky, read the signs, see which of us the gods favor to name it. And if the gods choose me? Remus asked. Something in his voice, playful but probing, testing the edges of a question that didn't feel like a question yet, but might become one. Then you name it, Romulus said, and I help you build it. Friendly, warm. And if they choose you, then I name it, and you help me build it. It sounded simple, reasonable. Two brothers making a rational decision to let divine will settle a question that didn't even feel like a question yet. Just a detail, just logistics, just names and signs and birds flying overhead, meaning nothing, until humans decided they meant something. Neither of them saw the trap they were walking into. Neither saw how certainty about brotherhood could coexist with certainty about divine right, and how those two certainties might not be compatible when forced to occupy the same space. Neither understood yet that some questions, once asked, can't be unasked. Gentle Doziger. They were just two young men standing on a hill at sunset, looking at empty land and seeing magnificence. The gods perhaps saw something else. But the gods were patient. They'd waited 22 years already. They could wait a little longer. That night they celebrated. Not in a palace throne room with protocol and proper seating arrangements, but around a fire the way they always had, bread and wine and stories told with the expansive joy of people who'd survived something that should have killed them, and were still processing the fact that they were alive and whole and had futures to plan. Friendly, warm. The shepherds who'd helped overthrow Romulus were there, and farmers from the nearby settlements who'd heard rumours and wanted to see if they were true, and even a few merchants who'd shown up with wine to sell and stayed for the entertainment. Someone had brought a liar. Someone else had brought terrible cheese that everyone ate anyway because free cheese was free cheese. To princes who smell like sheep, a voice shouted from somewhere in the crowd. Everyone drank. Friendly, warm, to kings who don't want thrones, another voice added, slurring slightly because the wine was working. Gentle. Everyone drank again. Romulus and Remus sat beside each other, shoulders touching the way they had since childhood. That particular closeness twins have, like two trees grown so close their branches intertwine. They watch their people now, somehow celebrate a future that existed mostly in imagination and hope, and the kind of unreasonable optimism required to look at empty land and see cities. That imagination, they were learning, was the raw material of everything real. Troy had started as imagination. Alba Longa had started as imagination. Every city, every wall, every law began as someone looking at nothing and saying, "What if?" "We're actually doing this," Remus said quietly, meant only for his brother. "Gentle, soft, we are," Romulus agreed. "It's going to be magnificent. It's going to be impossible." "Friendly, warm, same thing," Remus said, grinning. Romulus put his arm around his brother's shoulder, felt the solid reality of him alive, unharmed here. They'd survived drowning as infants, survived 22 years of not knowing who they were, survived a coup that could have killed them both. Whatever came next couldn't possibly be harder than what had already passed. Or so they thought. The fire burned low. The celebration wound down the way celebrations do, people drifting away to their shelters and tents, their voices fading into the darkness, leaving only the sound of wind through grass and the occasional laugh from someone too drunk to sleep yet. And the brothers sat together in comfortable silence, watching embers fade, not speaking because nothing needed saying. They were together. They were home. They had purpose. The augury could wait until morning. Morning had a way of arriving whether you were ready or not, bringing with it all the questions you'd successfully ignored in the comfortable darkness. Gentle, and with those questions the gods would speak. And with those questions, the gods would speak. But tonight belonged to brothers and to dreams, and to the last perfect moment before everything changed forever. Morning arrived. The way mornings do when something important is about to happen, reluctantly, as if the sun itself sensed the weight of the day ahead and considered staying in bed. The sky was pale, washed clean by night, holding that particular quality of light that exists only in the hour after dawn when the world is awake but hasn't yet committed to the full performance of being alive. Romulus woke first. He always did, some internal clock wound tighter than his brother's, demanding consciousness before it was strictly necessary. He lay still for a moment, listening to Remus's breathing beside him, steady and deep, the sound of someone who slept the way children sleep, without worry or rehearsal. They'd fallen asleep by the fire's embers, too tired to move to proper shelter, and now the morning dew had settled on their cloaks like a blanket made of tiny diamonds. Today they would ask the gods a question. Simple, really. Which of us should name the city? The answer would come in birds, vultures, probably, because vultures were sacred to Mars and Mars was their father, and divine parenthood apparently came with voting rights in matters of civic nomenclature. It should have felt momentous, epic. The kind of scene poets would describe with excessive adjectives and dramatic weather. Instead it felt ordinary, like any other morning when you wake up cold and damp and realize you need to do something mildly important before breakfast. Remus stirred, opened one eye and groaned. "Is it morning already?" "Friendly warm. Has been for a while," Romulus said. "Gentle, morning is a social construct," Remus mumbled into his cloak. "I refuse to acknowledge it. The gods are waiting. The gods can wait 5 more minutes. They're immortal. They have nothing but time." But he sat up anyway, rubbing his face, hair sticking up in directions that defied both gravity and dignity. Around them, the camp was stirring, men emerging from shelters, stretching, yawning, moving with the slow grace of people who'd celebrated too enthusiastically the night before, and were now paying interest on borrowed joy. They ate breakfast quickly. Bread and cheese and water from the stream that ran down the hill's western slope, cold enough to make your teeth ache. Faustulus joined them, chewing thoughtfully, saying nothing. He had the expression of a man watching his children do something he suspected was a mistake but knew better than to try preventing. "So," he said finally. "Augury." "Augury," Romulus confirmed. "You've decided which hill you're watching from." The brothers looked at each other. They hadn't actually. That particular detail had somehow escaped their planning, which in retrospect seemed like an oversight. The whole point of augury was watching from a sacred vantage point. Location mattered. The gods were notoriously picky about where you stood when asking them questions. Too far north and you'd get answers meant for someone else. Too far south and you'd just get confused seagulls. "I'll take the Palatine," Romulus said. It came out more decisive than he'd intended. almost like a claim rather than a suggestion. Remus blinked. I was going to take the Palatine. You can take the Aventine. It's higher, better view. It's higher, better view. The Palatine is where the wolf found us. It's where we grew up. Remus paused, searching for the right word. Ours. It's both of ours, Romulus said. That's why one of us should watch from there and the other from Aventine. Cover both hills, increase our chances of seeing something significant. It was logical, reasonable, the kind of practical thinking that made sense when you said it aloud. But underneath the logic was something else, the first quiet assertion of territory, the first small claim that one hill might belong more to one brother than the other. Remus studied his brother's face. You really want the Palatine? I really want us to get clear signs from the gods, Romulus said. The Palatine and Aventine are the obvious choices. We each take one. Simple. Remus said after a moment. I'll take Aventine. But if the gods favour me, and I name the city, you don't get to complain that you had the inferior viewing location. Agreed, Romulus said. And if they favour me, you don't get to claim the augury was invalid because you were on the wrong hill. They clasped hands. The gesture felt ceremonial, weighted with significance neither of them fully understood yet. Around them, the camp watched with the quiet attention of people who sensed they were witnessing something important but weren't quite sure what. They prepared separately. Not out of animosity, but out of ritual augury required purification, prayer, the proper mindset. You didn't just walk up a hill and start counting birds. You approached the gods with respect, with clean hands and clear intentions, with offerings that showed you understood you were asking for something you had no right to demand. Romulus washed in the stream, the water so cold it felt like punishment. He dressed in clean clothes, or as clean as shepherd's clothes got, which meant not actively muddy. He carried a small clay jar of wine for offering, and a knife in case the gods wanted blood, though he hoped they'd settle for wine. Gods, in his experience, were flexible about payment methods if you asked politely. He climbed the Palatine Hill alone. It wasn't far. He'd climbed it 10,000 times, knew every rock and route, could navigate it blind if necessary. But today it felt different, sacred. Like the hill itself knew it was about to become something more than just a hill where sheep grazed and boys played. It was about to become the foundation of something that would outlive everyone currently alive on it. At the summit he found a flat stone that faced north and east, the sacred directions, where Rome's fortune would come from according to every priest he'd ever reluctantly listened to. He poured wine on the ground, watched it soak into earth that had drunk rain and blood and now received this offering with the same indifference dirt shows to everything that falls on it. Mars, he said quietly. Father, if you're listening, and I assume you are, since that's supposedly your whole job, we need guidance. Remus and I want to build a city. We need to know which of us should name it. Send us signs, clear ones, please. Nothing ambiguous. We're not smart enough for riddles. The wind picked up slightly. Could have been divine acknowledgement. Could have been just wind. With gods you never really knew. On the Aventine Hill, Remus performed his own ritual. Similar prayers, similar offerings, similar requests for clarity. He sat on a rock outcropping that overlooked the valley, legs dangling over empty air, and watched the sky with the patient attention of someone who'd spent years watching sheep, and knew that important things rarely happened quickly. Mars, he said conversationally, as if talking to someone sitting beside him. It's me, your son, the one who got captured that one time. Probably not your finest moment as a father. But we all have bad days. Anyway, Romulus and I need help deciding who names the city. Send vultures or eagles or, honestly, anything that flies and looks vaguely meaningful. We'll interpret it. We're very good at interpreting things, sometimes correctly, sometimes not, but we try. A lark sang somewhere below. Indifferent to divine matters, concerned only with territorial disputes and mating rituals, the eternal priorities of small birds everywhere. Not you. Remus told the lark. You don't count. You're too pretty. We need something dramatic, something that screams divine will, not spring is lovely. The lark continued singing, unimpressed by theology. And sat some more. Augury, it turned out, was mostly waiting. The gods operated on their own schedule, which bore no resemblance to human convenience or mortal impatience. Minutes crawled past like tired pilgrims. The sun climbed higher, warming skin and stone alike. Below, the camp went about its business, people building, arguing, living, unaware that two young men on two different hills were asking questions that would determine their futures and possibly everyone else's too. Romulus watched the eastern sky, empty, blue, cloudless. Occasionally a small bird passed, sparrows, larks, once a confused duck that seemed lost, but nothing that qualified as a sign. He resisted the urge to check if Remus was seeing anything. That would be cheating. Each brother needed to witness independently, needed to receive his own answer without influence or comparison. On the Aventine, Remus watched the northern approach, also empty, also blue, also populated exclusively by birds that were clearly not interested in participating in human destiny. He tried to stay focused, tried to maintain the meditative state priests always talked about. But mostly he was getting bored and his back hurt from sitting on rock, and he was starting to think the gods had better things to do than settle naming disputes between shepherd boys with delusions of grandeur. Then, just past midday, when the sun was directly overhead and shadows had shrunk to nothing, Remus saw them. 6 vultures, flying low over the valley, black against blue sky, wings spread wide in that distinctive shape that made them unmistakable. They circled once, twice, 3 times, a lazy spiral that seemed almost deliberate, almost choreographed, and then continued west, disappearing behind the hills. Remus stood slowly, heart pounding. 6 vultures. That was significant. That was meaningful. That was possibly, probably, definitely divine communication. To Romulus immediately, wanted to announce his victory, wanted to claim his right to name the city based on clear celestial endorsement. But something stopped him. Protocol, maybe. Or fairness. Or the nagging certainty that celebrating too early was how hubris got you killed in every story ever told. So he waited, watched, made mental note of the time, the direction, the exact number. 6. Definitely 6. He'd counted 3 times to be sure. On the Palatine, Romulus saw nothing. The sky remained stubbornly empty of meaningful birds. He was beginning to suspect the gods were ignoring him specifically, perhaps punishment for that time as a child when he'd accidentally knocked over an altar while chasing a runaway sheep. Divine beings had long memories about property damage. Stutch considered giving up and just agreeing to let Remus name the city if Remus had seen anything significant. It wasn't about pride, it was about practicality. Cities needed names. They couldn't just stand around arguing about divine favor while buildings remained unfinished and laws remained unwritten. Then, just as he was about to descend the hill and end the augury, he saw them. Vultures. Not 6, 12. They appeared from the south, flying in formation, or as much formation as vultures ever managed, which was loose and slightly chaotic but still somehow coordinated. 12 black shapes against pale sky, wings catching light, circling the Palatine Hill in slow, deliberate passes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Romulus counted twice, then 3 times, then a 4th time because 12 seemed too convenient, too perfect, too much like the gods showing off. But the number didn't change. 12 vultures, twice what Remus had seen, if Remus had seen anything at all, which Romulus didn't know yet but suspected based on the way certainty had settled into his chest like a stone. The vultures circled 3 more times, then departed northeast, vanishing into distance and glare. Romulus stood alone on the summit, wind in his face, heart beating steady but strong, feeling like he'd just been spoken to by something larger than weather or chance. Mars had answered. The question was whether the answer would be accepted. They descended their respective hills at the same time, meeting at the base where their followers had gathered, sensing perhaps that something significant had occurred. Faustulus stood at the front, expression carefully neutral, Achates beside him, hand resting on his sword hilt, not from threat but from habit. Faustulus asked. "I saw 6 vultures," Remus said immediately, unable to contain it any longer. 6, flying over the valley at midday, clear as anything. The gods have spoken. Murmurs from the crowd. 6 vultures was significant, everyone knew that. 6 was a sacred number, not as sacred as 7, but more sacred than 5, and definitely more sacred than whatever Romulus had seen, which was probably nothing. Which meant, saw 12, Romulus said quietly. The murmuring stopped. Silence fell like a curtain, heavy and absolute. 12. 12 was more than 6. 12 was double. 12 was, depending on how you interpreted these things, either more significant or just later, which might not count the same way. Remus blinked. 12. 12, Romulus confirmed. After you saw yours, they circled the Palatine 3 times, then left northeast. Mine first, Remus said. Something in his voice, still friendly, still warm, but edged now with something harder. I saw 6 vultures at midday. You saw yours after. I saw first. That's what matters. You saw fewer, Romulus replied. I saw more. That's what matters. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable. This wasn't how divine clarity was supposed to work. The gods were supposed to give obvious signs, clear answers, unmistakable direction. Not whatever this was. Not competing visions that both seemed valid but contradicted each other. Not ambiguity wrapped in precision. First is what counts in augury, Remus insisted. Priority. Temporal precedence. The gods spoke to me first, which means they favor me. You saw more vultures because you sat there longer. That's not divine will, that's just patience. More is what counts in augury, Romulus countered. Quantity. Divine emphasis. The gods sent me twice as many birds because they wanted to make their preference absolutely clear. You saw fewer because your message was less important. Neither was shouting, neither was angry. But something had shifted. Some fundamental certainty about brotherhood and shared purpose, and the assumption that they wanted the same things in the same ways. The trap they hadn't seen was closing now, teeth meeting with gentle, inevitable pressure. Faustula stepped forward. Both of you saw vultures. Both received signs. This is, he paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. Complex. That's one word for it, Achates muttered. We need to decide which interpretation is correct, Romulus said. First or more. Temporal priority or quantitative superiority. The gods gave us 2 answers. We need to choose which one matters. Gentle, soft. The gods gave us 1 answer, Remus said. Mine. Yours came later, which makes it supplementary, confirmatory at best. You're welcome to help me build the city I'm about to name. Romulus looked at his brother. Really looked at him. Seeing not just Remus, but the shape of an argument that had no resolution, a question that had 2 correct answers depending on which axiom you accepted first. Time or quantity, process or result, the journey or the destination. No, Romulus said quietly. I saw more. That's what counts. The Palatine is where I stood. The Palatine is where the city will be built. I will name it. Remus stared at him. You're serious. Completely. After everything. After Alba Longa. After we agreed to do this together. After we promised to accept divine will. You're just claiming authority based on seeing more birds. Based on receiving a clearer sign from our father, Romulus corrected. Yes, I am. The crowd watched, holding collective breath, sensing that whatever happened next would determine more than just a city's name, would determine whether brotherhood could survive certainty, whether 2 people who loved each other could disagree about the gods and remain whole. Gentle, soft. Remus laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. More the laugh of someone who's just understood a joke at their own expense. So that's it. You saw more birds, so you win. That's how this works. That's how augury works, Romulus said. That's how we agreed it would work. The gods speak. We listen. We accept what they say. Friendly. Warmful. The gods spoke to me first, Remus said. And now there was heat in his voice, emotion breaking through the careful control. I saw 6 vultures at midday. You saw yours later. In augury, first matters. Ask any priest. Ask any augur. First is sacred. More is just. More. Ask any priest and they'll tell you quantity indicates divine favor, Romulus countered. More birds means stronger endorsement, clearer signal, less ambiguous communication. The gods wanted me to name the city, so they sent twice as many witnesses to make their preference absolutely unmistakable. To you, Remus said quietly. Unmistakable to you. Very mistakable to me. Romulus said nothing. What could he say? That he was right? He believed he was right. Believed it with the kind of certainty that feels like divine confirmation but might just be stubbornness wearing conviction's clothes. That Remus was wrong? Remus believed he was right with equal certainty, equal conviction, equal divine justification. 2 truths occupying the same space, incompatible and equally valid. The gods, it seemed, had a sense of humour after all. We'll discuss this, Faustulus said. trying to impose order on chaos. Calmly, rationally, we'll consult precedent, examine tradition, find a solution that honors both sides. Or we could just build 2 cities, someone suggested from the crowd. Helpful, unhelpful, probably joking, though in the moment it was hard to tell. Romulus and Remus stood facing each other. Not enemies, not yet, just brothers who'd asked a question and received 2 answers, and now had to live with the reality that the gods were either unclear or deliberately ambiguous, and either option was unsatisfying. "I saw first," Remus said again. Quieter now, not arguing, just stating fact, planting a flag in certainty, because certainty was all he had left. "I saw more," Romulus replied. Same tone, same quiet insistence, same flag, different hill. Neither would yield. Both were right. Both were wrong. And between them, the question hung unanswered. What happens when divine will speaks in 2 voices and demands you choose? The sun continued its arc across the sky, indifferent to human confusion. Birds flew, wind blew. The world continued turning because worlds don't stop for theological disputes, even ones that will echo through centuries. Somewhere, perhaps, Mars watched his sons argue about his intentions and felt what? Pride? Regret? Amusement at the peculiar tragedy of giving humans free will and divine signs and watching them collide? The gods never answered that question either. They just watched, and waited, and let mortals make their own disasters out of the raw material of heaven's ambiguity. Spring moved toward summer the way arguments move toward inevitability. Slowly at first, then all at once. The hills turned green, then golden, then brown at the edges where heat touched them. Flowers bloomed and faded. Sheep gave birth to lambs who learned to walk and then to run and then to ignore their mothers with the universal arrogance of adolescence everywhere. Time passed, life continued, and on the Palatine Hill, Romulus began building walls. Gentle. He hadn't announced it as a decision. Hadn't gathered people and declared his intentions with the kind of formal ceremony that usually preceded important actions. He'd simply started, one morning, marking out boundaries with a plough pulled by a white bull and a white cow. The traditional method for founding cities when you wanted the gods to pay attention and approve. The furrow was shallow but clear, a line in the earth that said, "Here is inside, there is outside, cross this at your own risk." Remus watched from the Aventine. He could see everything from up there. The line of the furrow, the shape it made circling the Palatine summit, the men gathering to help Romulus with the work that came next. Building, actual walls, not metaphorical boundaries but stone and timber, concrete and permanent, the kind of thing that said, "I'm right, and I'm proceeding regardless of whether you agree." He felt what? Anger would be too simple, betrayal too dramatic. Mostly he felt tired. Tired of the argument that wouldn't resolve. Tired of certainty meeting certainty with no space between for compromise. Tired of loving someone and disagreeing with them so fundamentally that love started feeling like an obstacle rather than a foundation. For 3 weeks after the augury, they'd tried to find middle ground. Consulted priests who gave contradictory advice with equal confidence. Examined precedents that proved everything and nothing. Debated late into the night with the kind of circular logic that makes everyone exhausted but resolves nothing. First versus more, time versus quantity. Which divine signal mattered more when the gods had apparently sent both? No answer emerged. Just 2 brothers growing slowly apart, like trees planted close together that gradually bend away from each other, seeking their own light. Romulus worked. That's what he did when words failed. Worked with his hands, built things, imposed order on chaos through the simple act of putting stones on top of other stones until they resembled purpose. The walls rose slowly, not high yet, not impressive, just knee-height foundations that marked where higher walls would eventually stand. Men helped, some enthusiastically, some reluctantly, some because they'd already chosen sides in an argument they didn't fully understand but recognized as important. The work had its comedy. One man, a Trojan named Sergius who meant well but thought poorly, insisted on using a building technique he'd learnt in childhood that involved extensive use of mud and hope. The wall section he built lasted 2 days before collapsing during a light rain. Romulus reassigned him to carrying water, which had less structural responsibility and more opportunities for success. Another volunteer, a Latin farmer named Quintus, brought his son, a boy of perhaps 8 who asked endless questions with the bright curiosity of someone who hadn't yet learned that adults mostly didn't know what they were doing either. "Why do walls need to be straight?" the boy asked. Romulus paused, considered several complicated answers involving mathematics and engineering and divine geometry, then said, "Because crooked walls fall down." The boy accepted this with solemn satisfaction. Sometimes simple answers were best. But mostly the work was quiet, rhythmic. The sound of stone on stone, timber being cut and shaped, men calling to each other in the shorthand that develops when people work together long enough. Not conversation exactly. Just the minimum communication required to move heavy things without dropping them on anyone's feet. Romulus worked alongside them. Not directing from a distance, but lifting, hauling, sweating in the sun like everyone else. His hands blistered, then calloused. His back ached in the mornings. That particular spine-deep pain that comes from bending and lifting and discovering you're not as young as you thought. But the walls grew. Slowly, imperfectly, but grew nonetheless. And every stone he placed felt like an argument won. Not against Remus, but against doubt. Against the fear that maybe he was wrong. Maybe first did matter more than more. Maybe divine will had spoken in temporal priority, and he was just too stubborn to hear it. But the walls kept rising anyway, certainty built in stone and mortar. On the Aventine, Remus built nothing. He sat mostly, watching, thinking thoughts that circled like birds but never quite landed anywhere useful. His followers, and he had followers now, though he'd never asked for them, sat with him, waiting, not for orders exactly, but for some signal that he hadn't given up, hadn't conceded, still believed in his own divine mandate. "You could build your own walls," Ashatid suggested one afternoon. He divided his loyalty carefully, spent mornings on the Palatine with Romulus, afternoons on the Aventine with Remus, trying to be fair to both brothers and succeeding mostly in satisfying neither. On the Aventine, make your claim concrete. Show the gods you're serious. Remus smiled faintly. Build competing walls? Have two cities side by side, both claiming divine favor, both insisting they're right. That sounds like a recipe for more arguments, not fewer. It would be interesting, though, Ashatid admitted. From a spectator perspective, historically memorable. Gentle, soft. "I don't want to be historically memorable," Remus said quietly. "I want my brother to acknowledge that I saw vultures first, that I have a legitimate claim, that maybe, just maybe, he's wrong about this." Ashatid said nothing. What could he say? That Romulus was stubborn? Remus already knew that. That divine will was unclear? Everyone knew that. That sometimes brothers fought and nobody won? That seemed obvious enough it didn't need stating. So they sat in silence, watching walls rise on the neighboring hill, and felt history happening without their participation, which was worse somehow than being defeated. Being ignored was worse than being opposed. Gentle, soft weeks after the augury, the walls on the Palatine reached waist height. Not much, but enough to look like intention rather than accident. Enough to say, this is permanent, this is sacred, this is the line between civilization and wilderness. Romulus walked the perimeter at dawn, inspecting work, checking joins, occasionally finding a stone placed poorly and moving it himself rather than pointing out someone else's mistake. Leadership, he was learning, was less about giving orders and more about quietly fixing problems before they became obvious. He tried not to think about Remus, tried not to wonder what his brother was doing, whether he was angry or hurt or just disappointed. They hadn't spoken in weeks, not out of active hostility, but from a kind of exhausted avoidance. The way people avoid conversations they know will only hurt and resolve nothing. Easier to build walls than maintain relationships, apparently. Stone was simpler than brothers. That afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point and shadows shrank to nothing, Romulus saw Remus approaching, walking down from the Aventine with the casual grace of someone who'd decided something and was now seeing it through regardless of consequences. He wasn't alone. Several men followed at a distance, close enough to support if needed, but far enough to pretend they weren't involved if things went badly. Romulus straightened, set down the stone he'd been examining, and waited. His own men noticed, stopped working, formed a loose semicircle that was definitely not threatening but absolutely ready to become threatening if circumstances required. The air felt heavy, weighted with all the words that hadn't been said, and probably wouldn't be said now either. Gentle, Remus stopped at the wall's edge, looked at it, really looked at it, studying the stonework, the height, the careful construction that spoke of planning and effort and commitment. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between admiration and something darker. "Nice walls," he said finally. His tone was light, conversational, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been angry. Friendly, warm. "Thank you," Romulus replied carefully. "We've worked hard on them." "I can tell." Very impressive, very permanent looking, very... He paused, choosing his word deliberately. Low, Thoughtful felt something tighten in his chest. What? Gentle. The walls, Remus said, still in that same light tone that carried poison. They're low. A child could jump them, maybe even a particularly ambitious sheep. I'm not sure they're serving their intended purpose of, keeping things out or in or whatever walls are supposed to do. The men watching shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't an observation. This was an insult wrapped in architectural criticism, delivered with enough casual humor to be deniable but not enough to be missed. They're not finished, Romulus said quietly. These are foundations. They'll be built higher, obviously. Oh, obviously, Remus agreed. I'm sure you have a whole plan. Probably very detailed, very thought through. But right now, as they currently stand, he stepped closer to the wall, examining it with exaggerated attention. They're barely an obstacle. More of a suggestion, really. A polite request that people stay out rather than an actual barrier. Thoughtful, Romulus started. Gentle burn, Remus interrupted, and with easy, casual grace he stepped over the wall. Not jumping dramatically, not making a show of it, just stepping over it the way you'd step over a fallen log on a path. Simple, effortless, deliberately insulting. He landed inside the sacred boundary, inside the line Romulus had drawn with ritual and prayer and divine consultation, inside the space that was supposed to be protected and sacred and meaningful. And he smiled, friendly, warm. See? Easy. Any barbarian could do that. Any enemy army could just... He stepped back over the wall, out again, then in again. Walk right in. Doesn't seem very secure. Something broke. Not dramatically, not with sound or violence, just broke, like ice cracking under weight it had been bearing too long. Romulus felt it happen inside him, felt the last restraint of patience and brotherly love give way to something colder and harder and absolutely certain. Get out, he said quietly. I'm trying to help, Remus said, still smiling but with an edge now, pointing out a design flaw. These walls won't protect anything. They're symbolic at best, useless at worst. You're wasting everyone's time building something that doesn't work. They're sacred, Romulus said. I consecrated them. I dedicated them to Mars. I asked the gods to bless them, and you're mocking them. Gentle, I'm mocking you, Remus corrected. The walls are just. He stepped over again, deliberately, provocatively, convenient. The men watching held their breath. This was worse than argument. This was contempt. This was taking something someone cared about and demonstrating publicly and undeniably that it was worthless, that all the work and planning and divine consultation had resulted in something a grown man could step over without effort. Last warning, Romulus said. His voice was still quiet but had changed somehow, gone from human to something else, something that carried the weight of divine parentage and sacred vows and absolute conviction. Get out. Respect the boundary. Accept that the gods chose this place and these walls and me. Or what? Remus asked. He was inside the boundary again, standing on sacred ground with his arms crossed and his expression caught between amusement and challenge. You'll make me leave? You'll enforce your made-up rules about your meaningless walls that don't actually accomplish anything? You'll... What happened next happened too fast to be certain about details. Someone moved, Romulus, or possibly Sella, one of Romulus's closest men who'd been standing nearby with a staff, watching the exchange with growing tension. Someone struck, someone fell. Gentle, soft, backward, hand going to his head, where the staff had caught him. Not hard, not at first. Just a glancing blow, more surprise than injury. He looked up, looked at Romulus, looked at Sella, trying to understand what had just happened and why. So will die anyone who crosses my walls, Romulus said. Or Sella said. Or maybe both said simultaneously. Historical accounts would disagree forever about who spoke, who struck, who was responsible. But the words were said, the staff rose again, and this time rose again. This time the blow wasn't glancing. Remus fell. Not dramatically, not with poetry or symbolism or any of the grace you'd expect from a son of Mars meeting his destiny. Just fell. Heavily. Finally. The way people fall when life leaves them, and gravity reasserts its ancient claim. Silence. Complete and absolute. Even the wind stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what happened when brothers became murderers, when love became violence, when sacred walls demanded blood for their consecration. Romulus stared at his brother's body. Celifri stood frozen, staff still raised, face white with shock or horror, or the terrible realization that some actions can't be undone no matter how much you wish you'd made different choices. The watching men made no sound. What sound was there to make? What words existed for this? And time did something strange, stretched and compressed simultaneously, a moment that lasted forever and no time at all. A pause where the world reconsidered its trajectory and decided with cosmic indifference to continue anyway, because worlds don't stop for tragedy, no matter how personal it feels. Romulus knelt beside his brother, touched his face. Still warm, still Remus, still the person who'd shared his mother's womb and his childhood, and his dreams of building something worth building. Still his twin, his other half, the one person who'd understood him without explanation. Gentle. Remus, he said quietly, as if saying the name might call him back, as if death was just a misunderstanding that could be corrected with proper communication. But Remus didn't answer, didn't move, didn't smile or joke or make light of serious things the way he always had. Just lay there, becoming past tense, becoming memory, becoming the price of certainty. Someone said something, a Chates probably, trying to help, trying to make sense of senseless things, but Romulus didn't hear it, heard only the sound of his own breathing, too loud in his ears, each breath an accusation. You're alive, he's not. You wanted walls, you got them. Was it worth it? Thoughtful. He didn't know, wouldn't know, couldn't know, because knowledge required perspective, and perspective required distance, and distance required time, and time wouldn't help with this, would never help with this, would only make it more permanent. They carried Remus to the Palatine Hill. His hill. The one he'd wanted to build his city on. The one he'd claimed with temporal priority and genuine divine favor that just happened to conflict with someone else's genuine divine favor. Romulus helped carry him, insisted on it, despite the looks from men who weren't sure if that was appropriate or grotesque, or just the action of someone in shock who didn't know what else to do. They buried him at the summit, looking west towards sunset, and the future he wouldn't see. No elaborate ceremony, no priest offering platitudes about divine will and necessary sacrifice. Just a grave, quickly dug, filled with a person who'd been alive that morning, and had made the mistake of stepping over a wall someone else had decided was sacred. Romulus stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left. Stood there as the sun set, as stars emerged, as the night air grew cold enough to make him shiver but not cold enough to make him leave. He'd won, he'd proven his point, he'd defended his sacred boundary with the kind of absolute commitment that would echo through history and teach everyone who came after that Rome's walls were serious business. He'd also killed his brother. That echoed too, differently, louder, would echo forever in his own head, replaying the moment with cruel clarity every time he closed his eyes. I was right, he said aloud, to Remus or the gods or himself. I saw more vultures. The gods chose the Palatine, chose me. I was right. The night offered no response. The gods, if they were listening, said nothing. Remus obviously said nothing, and Romulus was left alone with his rightness, discovering too late that being right wasn't the same as being good, and winning wasn't the same as succeeding. I'm sorry, he added, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Being right? Being stubborn? Being so certain about divine will that he'd let that certainty destroy the one person who mattered most? All of it. None of it. Sorry was inadequate, but it was all he had. The stars watched with the indifference of things too distant to care. Below, on the Palatine, the wall stood, low but permanent, sacred but blood-stained, foundation of something great but built on something terrible. Rome had its first king, its first walls, its first sacred boundary. Gentle, soft had its first murder, its first tragedy, its first lesson that greatness and goodness don't always travel together. Romulus descended the Aventine alone, leaving his brother in the ground and his certainty in ruins. The city would rise, the walls would grow higher, the gods would be appeased or at least satisfied. History would remember him as founder, king, the man who built something that would outlast empires. But tonight, he was just a man who'd killed his brother over a disagreement about birds, and no amount of divine favor could make that feel like victory. Dawn came, because dawn always came, indifferent to human grief or divine irony. The sun rose over the Palatine Hill, touching walls that were now consecrated in ways Romulus had never intended. Blood and stone, mixed together, becoming foundation. The kind of foundation that lasts because it costs too much to abandon. Gentle, He hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. Sleep felt like surrender, like admitting that yesterday had actually happened and couldn't be undone by staying awake and refusing to accept it. But morning arrived anyway, bringing with it all the responsibilities of being the last brother standing, the sole founder, the king who'd won an argument by losing everything that mattered. The camp was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, tense quiet. The kind that happens when people don't know what to say and are trying very hard not to say the wrong thing. Men moved through their morning routines with careful efficiency, avoiding eye contact, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all. No one knew the proper etiquette for the day after fratricide. There probably wasn't one. Some situations were too specific for tradition to cover. Romulus sat on the wall. His wall, the wall that had been worth defending, worth killing for, worth destroying brotherhood over. It felt the same as it had yesterday. Rough stone, still low, still unfinished, still just a line drawn in earth and rock saying here matters more than there. But it was different now, heavier. Every stone carried weight that had nothing to do with mass. Faustulus approached slowly, the way you approach wounded animals or grieving kings. He sat beside Romulus without asking permission, without offering platitudes, without pretending he understood something that probably couldn't be understood. Just sat, shared silence, let the morning happen around them. Gentle, soft, mocked the walls, Romulus said finally. His voice was rough, unused since last night's apologies to an unhearing grave. He stepped over them. He treated them like they were nothing. I know, Faustulus said. The gods chose the Palatine. They sent me 12 vultures. 12. That's clear divine communication. Unmistakable preference. I was right. Gentle. Faustulus repeated. So why? Romulus stopped, searching for words that would make sense of senseless things. Why does being right feel like this? Faustulus looked at him with the tired wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to know that being right and being good were different things, and that the gods frequently tested humans by making them choose between them. Because you loved him, he said simply. And love doesn't care about auguries or divine will or who saw more birds. Love just cares that he's gone. Achates arrived next, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He'd failed at his self-appointed task of keeping both brothers alive, and the failure sat on him like armor made of guilt. The men are asking, he said quietly. What happens now? Do we continue building? Do we... He paused, uncertain how to phrase it delicately. Acknowledge what happened? Have ceremony? Pretend it didn't occur? Gentle. We continue, Romulus said. Flat, certain. Because what else was there? Stop? Abandon everything because the cost was too high? That would make Remus's death meaningless rather than just tragic, and meaningless felt worse somehow. At least tragedy had weight. The walls go higher. The city gets built. That's what we came here to do. And Remus, Achates asked carefully. Gets remembered, Romulus said. On the Aventine, his hill. We'll build a shrine, make offerings, tell stories about him that are true, not cleaned up or made noble, just true. He was brave and funny, and saw 6 vultures first. He should have been king alongside me. But the gods... He stopped, realizing he was about to blame the gods for his own choices, which felt cowardly. I chose the walls over him. That's the truth. That's what gets remembered. Achates nodded slowly. The men will follow you, he said. They already do. But they're scared. Not of you, of what happened. That certainty can lead to that. That brothers can become that. Gentle, Romulus said. They should be scared. I'm scared. Fear seems like the appropriate response to discovering that divine favor and human love aren't compatible, and when they conflict, people die. Over the following days, the work continued. The walls rose, slowly, steadily, built by men who hammered and hauled with a new carefulness, as if afraid that careless work might invoke similar violence. Every stone placed felt like penance. Every section completed felt like apology to someone who couldn't hear apologies anymore. Gentle, soft Romulus worked harder than anyone. Not from enthusiasm, but from necessity. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant replaying yesterday's choices on eternal loop until he wanted to scream or sleep or do something equally useless. Better to work, better to build, better to create something that would outlast the guilt and prove that the cost, however terrible, had purchased something real. People came from neighboring settlements, drawn by rumors of the new city and its violent foundation. Some came to help, seeing opportunity in a place that was willing to enforce its boundaries with absolute commitment. Others came just to look, to see the walls that had cost a brother's life, to witness the spot where fratricide had become civic foundation. Romulus let them look, let them judge, didn't particularly care what they thought because their opinions couldn't change what had already happened. One visitor, a merchant from a coastal town whose name Romulus immediately forgot, asked if the walls were cursed. Cursed? Romulus repeated, genuinely confused. No, why would they be cursed? The merchant gestured vaguely at everything. Brother's blood, violent foundation. Usually that's cursed. Romulus considered this seriously. No, he said finally. The merchant decided to do business elsewhere. Which was fine. Rome didn't need merchants who were superstitious about blood. Rome was going to be built on practical principles, like absolute enforcement of boundaries and complete commitment to divine will, as interpreted by whoever won the augury argument. It sounded better when you didn't say it aloud. Tree. 3 weeks after Remus's death, they held a ceremony. Not a funeral that had already happened, quick and private and painful. This was different. A dedication, an acknowledgement, a public statement that what had happened was both terrible and necessary, tragic and foundational, the kind of thing that couldn't be undone but could at least be incorporated into the city's story. They gathered at the Aventine summit, at Remus's grave, at sunset because sunset felt appropriately melancholy. Romulus brought wine, the good kind, not the terrible stolen grape variety Remus had joked about. Brought bread, brought offerings that felt inadequate but were all he had. What do you give dead brothers? What sacrifice erases fratricide? Remus, he said aloud, addressing the grave like it was a person because that felt less insane than addressing empty air. You saw 6 vultures. You saw them first. You had a legitimate claim to name the city, found it, rule it. The gods spoke to you with clarity and divine favor. He paused. I just saw more birds, and I decided that mattered more than you did. The gathered crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the speech they'd expected. No justification, no claims of divine necessity, no attempt to make the killing noble or inevitable. Just acknowledgement of choice and consequence. Gentle, soft. I'm building the city anyway, Romulus continued. Not because you'd want me to fail spectacularly and learn humility, but because someone has to. Because the gods sent us here for this. Because Troy fell and Aeneas suffered and Lavinia endured and Ascanius heard Apollo's prophecy and all of that led here. To this moment, to these walls. He poured wine on the grave. I'm calling it Rome. Not because I won the argument, I'm not sure anyone won, but because that's what the Palatine demanded. That's what the augury said. If you squint and interpret generously and ignore everything that contradicts it. He knelt, placed bread on the grave, stayed there longer than was probably necessary. When he stood, his face was wet but his voice was steady. I'll build something worth this, he said quietly. I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if any city is worth a brother, but I'll try. The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving Romulus alone with the grave and the sunset, and the weight of promises he wasn't sure he could keep. That night, back on the Palatine, Romulus walked the perimeter of his walls. They'd grown since Remus died, now chest height, solid, beginning to look like actual fortifications rather than ambitious landscaping. Torches burned at intervals, casting shadows that made the walls look taller, more imposing, more like the boundary between civilization and chaos they were meant to be. He thought about his brother, about childhood racing through these same hills, inventing games, arguing about nothing important, sharing the easy joy of people who assumed they'd always be together because why wouldn't they be? About discovering their heritage, the shock, the sudden weight of divine parentage, the realization that they were meant for something bigger than sheep. About Alba Longa, the coup, the victory, the moment when everything seemed possible and the future stretched ahead bright with potential. Gentle, soft about the augury. That cursed, blessed, inevitable augury. If he could go back, would he change it? Accept Remus's claim. Let temporal priority trump quantitative superiority. Build on the Aventine instead of the Palatine. Let his brother name the city and rule it while he helped from the background. He didn't know. Wanted to say yes because yes made him less monstrous. But honesty forced him to admit, probably not. He'd believed, still believed, that 12 vultures mattered more than 6. That the gods had spoken clearly to him. That the Palatine was sacred, was chosen, was correct. And that belief had killed his brother. That was the paradox. Both things were true simultaneously. The Palatine watch was the right choice, and defending it was the wrong one. Divine will had spoken, and divine will was terrible. The gods had tested them, and Romulus had passed by failing in the most fundamental way possible. He wondered if this was what Apollo had meant when he'd spoken to Ascanius all those years ago. Thus one rises to the stars, son of gods and ancestor of gods yet to be. Rising required leaving things behind. Stars were far from Earth. Distance created perspective, but also isolation. To rise, you had to lose weight, and sometimes that weight was your brother. The thought didn't comfort him. Nothing comforted him, but it provided framework, context, the beginning of a story he could tell himself that made the senseless slightly less senseless. Gentle, soft, the walls grew higher. The city took shape, not quickly, not elegantly, but stubbornly, the way Rome would do everything for the next 1,000 years. Buildings rose inside the sacred boundary. Streets formed, meandering at first, then gradually organizing into something resembling planned layout. People arrived, refugees, opportunists, criminals fleeing justice elsewhere, anyone willing to live in a city whose foundation was violence and whose king was a fratricide. Romulus accepted everyone. He'd learned something from killing Remus, learned that perfection was impossible and purity was a luxury Rome couldn't afford. So he welcomed thieves and exiles, runaway slaves and dispossessed farmers, anyone willing to work and follow laws and respect walls. Rome would be built by broken people, which seemed appropriate for a city founded in brokenness. He created laws. Simple ones at first. Don't steal, don't kill unless someone crosses the walls without permission, contribute to the common defense. Later, more complex regulations emerged: property rights, dispute resolution, the proper way to address grievances without resorting to violence. He became, despite himself, the thing he'd never wanted to be, a king. Not just a founder, but a ruler, responsible for people who looked to him for order and justice and wisdom he wasn't sure he possessed. Sometimes late at night, when the city was quiet and the walls cast long shadows in moonlight, he thought he saw Remus. Not a ghost. He didn't believe in ghosts, or if he did, believed they had better things to do than haunt brothers. Just memory, so vivid it felt like presence. Remus laughing at something absurd, Remus arguing about auguries, Remus stepping over walls with casual contempt, proving a point that didn't need proving, and paying for it with everything. Gentle, I'm building it, Romulus would say to these memories, these visions, these conversations with someone who wasn't there, exactly like we planned. Walls and laws and people willing to believe that this empty hill can become something worth believing in. You should be here. You should be doing this with me. I'm sorry you're not. The memories never answered. But sometimes the wind shifted, and for a moment it sounded almost like laughter, the kind of laughter Remus would make at someone taking themselves too seriously. And Romulus would smile despite himself, despite everything, and continue building. Years would pass. Rome would grow. The walls would rise higher, expand wider, encompass more hills and more people, and more ambition than anyone standing at Remus's grave that sunset could have imagined. Romulus would become legend, part king, part god, part cautionary tale about certainty and the cost of being right. Gentle. But all of that was future, invisible from where he stood now. Now he was just a man standing on walls that had cost too much, looking out over a city that didn't exist yet, carrying guilt that would never fully diminish, but might eventually be incorporated into something larger than itself. Remus saw 6 vultures first. He would tell every child who asked about Rome's founding, making sure the story stayed honest even when it was easier to lie. He had every right to name the city. I saw 12 vultures after. I decided that mattered more. I was right by one interpretation of augury. I was wrong by every interpretation of brotherhood. He would pause here, letting the weight settle. Rome is built on both of those truths. Remember that. When you enforce our boundaries, when you defend our walls, remember what they cost. Remember who paid so you could stand here safely. Some children would understand. Most wouldn't until they were older, until they'd made their own terrible choices and lived with their own impossible consequences. But he told the story anyway, again and again, making sure Remus was remembered not as villain or victim, but as person flawed and funny and right about birds and wrong about walls, and gone too soon for reasons that made sense at the time and no sense at all in retrospect. The sun set over Rome. The walls cast shadows, and Romulus stood alone, which was what he'd chosen when he chose certainty over compromise, what he'd earned when he defended boundaries that mattered more than people. He'd built something that would last, something that would echo through centuries, shape empires, define civilization itself. The walls would stand, the city would grow, Rome would become eternal. But eternity, he was learning, was cold company. Colder than brothers, colder than doubt, colder than the alternative of being wrong but together instead of right but alone. The gods had given him what he asked for. They'd answered his prayers, accepted his augury, blessed his walls, sanctified his city with blood and certainty and absolute divine favor. He wished, sometimes, that they hadn't. But wishes changed nothing. The walls stood, Rome endured, and Romulus remained its king, victorious, vindicated, and utterly, completely alone, which was, perhaps, exactly what he deserved, and exactly what Rome needed. As gentle. The gods, as always, had the last word. They just never bothered explaining what it meant. Thank you for listening to this episode of Roman History for Sleep. If you enjoyed this journey through Rome's founding from the she-wolf's cave to the walls consecrated in blood, please consider subscribing to the channel. New episodes are being released, each one continuing the complete chronological story of Rome, from its mythological beginnings to the fall of the Western Empire. You can support this project by liking the video, leaving a comment about which part of the story resonated with you, or sharing it with anyone who appreciates history told slowly, carefully, and made for rest. Next episode, we'll continue with Romulus's sole rule, how he built Rome from that terrible beginning, how he populated the city, and how one man's guilt became the foundation of civilization. Until then, sleep well. May your dreams be as enduring as Rome's walls, and may you wake rested enough to hear how the story continues. Good night.